They say a king's greatest enemy sits across the battlefield. They're wrong. His greatest enemy sleeps beside him, whispers love into his ear, and empties his treasury while he bleeds for a crown that's already hollow. Adrian Vale won a war and lost everything that mattered. And the woman he threw away? She didn't just survive. She became the one thing he could never be without her, whole. Stay with me until the very last word of this story. If it hits you the way I think it will, leave a like and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. The throne room smelled like wet stone and old blood. Not the fresh kind, not the kind that still carried heat from a living body. This was the smell of something long dead, something that had soaked into the cracks between the marble tiles and would never wash out no matter how many servants scrubbed on their knees. 3 months of war had turned the grandest hall in the kingdom of Aldenmere into a butcher's yard dressed in silk banners. Adrian Vale stood at the far end of that hall with his hand braced against the doorframe, because his left leg had not stopped shaking since the ride back from the southern front. A piece of enemy iron was still buried somewhere beneath his kneecap. The field surgeon had told him they could dig it out, but there had been no time, but there was never any time. So the metal stayed and his knee ground bone against foreign steel with every step, and Adrian had learned to walk through it the way he had learned to walk through everything else in his miserable, blood-soaked life, by pretending it did not exist. He was 31 years old. His hair, once black as riverstone, now carried threads of gray above both temples. His jaw was sharper than it had been a year ago because he had dropped weight during the siege, the kind of weight a man loses when he forgets to eat for days at a stretch and runs on nothing but adrenaline and fury. His eyes were the color of iron in winter light, and they moved across the destroyed throne room with the slow, gutted recognition of a man surveying the corpse of his own ambition. The stained glass windows on the eastern wall were shattered. Someone had thrown a battering ram through them during the final assault on the capital. Colored shards still littered the floor like the scales of some dead mythical creature. The oak table where his war council once sat had been split down the middle with an axe. Tapestries depicting the Vale dynasty hung in ribbons from their iron rods, slashed by swords that did not care about lineage or legacy. Captain Rowan Greaves appeared behind him. Rowan was the only officer Adrian had left who was not dead, defected, or drunk in a ditch somewhere between here and the southern border. He was a thick man, built like a barrel someone had hammered arms onto, with a beard that had not seen a blade in weeks, and eyes that had seen too much of everything. Rowan cleared his throat. "Your Majesty." Adrian did not turn around. "Don't call me that. It's your title, sir. A title is a word people agree to respect." Adrian finally turned. His face was filthy. A smear of dried mud ran from his left cheekbone down to his jaw. "Look around, Rowan. Tell me what in this room suggests anyone still agrees." Rowan looked. He did not argue. The silence between them was thick with things neither man wanted to say out loud. Adrian limped towards the throne. It sat on a raised stone platform at the head of the room, carved from a single block of gray granite centuries ago by the first Vale king. It was supposed to be indestructible. It was supposed to outlast everything. But someone had taken a hammer to the left armrest, and a deep crack now ran through the seat from front to back, splitting the carved wolf emblem almost perfectly in half. Adrian lowered himself into it. The stone was ice cold and it sent a shock through his spine. He gripped both armrests, one whole and one broken, and he sat there in the silence of his ruined kingdom like a man holding onto the edges of his own grave. "Where are we, Rowan?" "Numbers. Honest ones." Rowan pulled a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. It was stained with something brown. 1,100 soldiers still standing, give or take the ones who will desert by morning. Treasury is empty. I mean empty, Adrian. Not low, not strained. There is nothing in the vault. The grain stores were burned during the siege. The northern villages are refusing to send supplies because half of them think you are already dead, and the other half wish you were. Adrian closed his eyes. And the southern lords? Lord Harlan declared independence 2 days ago. Lord Mercer followed him yesterday. Lord Ashworth has not declared anything yet, but his men pulled back to his territory, and he is not answering ravens. So the alliance is finished. It was finished the moment the capital fell, sir. We just did not have the honesty to say it out loud. Adrian opened his eyes and stared at the cracked ceiling above him. Rainwater had started leaking through a hole in the roof, dripping in a slow, maddening rhythm onto the stone floor 10 feet from the throne. "Where is she?" he said. Rowan's face changed. It was a subtle thing, a tightening around his mouth, a slight drop in his shoulders. But Adrian had known this man for 9 years, and he could read him the way a sailor reads weather. "Rowan." "Where is Celine?" Rowan exhaled through his nose. "Gone." The word landed like a fist. Adrian's grip on the armrest tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Gone where?" "She left 3 nights ago. Took a carriage, 4 personal guards, and—" Rowan paused, and the pause was louder than anything he had said so far. "And what?" "And the emergency reserves. The ones you kept sealed in the lower vault beneath the council chamber. The gold, the jewels, the foreign currency. All of it. She cleaned it out, and she was across the border before anyone thought to check." Adrian did not move. He did not blink. He sat perfectly still on that cracked throne while the information settled into his chest like a blade sliding between ribs. The rain dripped. The wind whistled through the shattered windows. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking at nothing. How much? Enough to fund a small army for 2 years. Enough to rebuild every village between here and the coast. Rowan's voice was flat, careful, the voice of a man delivering news he knew could get him killed. She did not rush. She planned it, had forged transit papers, bribed the border guards weeks in advance. This was not panic. This was strategy. Adrian's jaw clenched so hard that a muscle in his cheek began to twitch. He could feel something building behind his sternum, something vast and black and old, something that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but some unholy marriage of both that he had no name for and no defense against. "She told me she loved me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "She stood in this room, in front of the council, in front of the generals, and she told me she would die before she let this kingdom fall." Rowan said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth was sitting in the room with them like a third person, ugly and patient and impossible to ignore. Adrian's mind was doing something dangerous. It was reaching backward, pulling up memories he had spent months burying under the weight of war and ambition and the particular kind of willful blindness that only powerful men are capable of. He was thinking about Celine's hands on his shoulders the night before the final battle, her voice in his ear, her promises wrapped in silk and delivered with the kind of conviction that made a man believe his own lies. But underneath that, deeper, in a place he had walled off with bricks made of pride and shame and cowardice, another face was surfacing. A face he had not allowed himself to think about in almost a year. Pale skin and dark eyes and a mouth that rarely smiled but when it did could stop a room cold. Hair the color of autumn leaves, always slightly windblown because she spent more time walking the gardens and village roads than sitting in parlors. Hands that were never idle, always mending, always building, always reaching for something that needed fixing. "Evelina." He said the name out loud before he could stop himself, and the sound of it in the empty throne room hit him like a physical blow. Rowan looked at him sharply, but said nothing. Evelina Ashford had been his Luna, bonded, chosen, the woman the old laws said was his equal in all things, his partner in rule, his anchor when the storms came. She had been quiet where Celine was loud, steady where Celine was dazzling, honest where Celine was polished. She had warned him about the Southern Rebellion 6 months before it started. She had warned him about Lord Harlan's treachery. She had warned him about Celine. And Adrian, drunk on power and blinded by a woman who knew exactly how to make him feel like a god, had done the one thing a king should never do. He had ignored the only person in the room who was telling the truth. Not just ignored, he had humiliated her. The memory hit him now with the force of a battering ram. The council dinner 8 months ago, before the war had started, when everything was still politics and posturing and the illusion of control. Evelina had stood at the far end of the table and told the assembled lords that Celine's financial dealings did not add up, that funds were being moved to accounts that did not exist in any royal ledger, that something was deeply and fundamentally wrong. And Adrian, sitting at the head of that table with Celine's hand on his arm, had looked at his own Luna, the woman bonded to him by law and by something older and deeper than law, and he had said, in front of every lord and general in the kingdom, "Evelina, if you cannot bring proof instead of paranoia, perhaps you should leave the governance to those who understand it." The room had gone silent. The lords had looked away, some in discomfort, some in satisfaction, because there were always men who enjoyed watching a woman be cut down by the man who was supposed to protect her. Evelina had not cried. That was the thing Adrian remembered most clearly now, sitting alone in his devastation. She had not cried. She had looked at him with those dark eyes, and something in them had shifted. Some light that had been burning quietly for years had simply gone out. And she had said, very calmly, "I hope you remember this moment, Adrian, because one day you will wish you had listened." Then she had turned and walked out of that room, and Adrian had let her go. He had let her walk through those doors and down the marble corridor and out of his life, and he had turned back to the table and continued the meeting as if the most important person in the room had not just left it forever. Celine had leaned close to him after that dinner and whispered, "You did the right thing. She has always been jealous of us." And Adrian had believed her, because believing her was easy, and the truth was not. He pressed his palms against his eyes now, sitting on the broken throne, and he made a sound that was not a word. It came from somewhere below his chest, from somewhere in the basement of his body, where all the things he refused to feel had been piling up like cordwood for years, and it was the sound of a man finally beginning to understand the full scope of what he had done. Rowan shifted his weight. "Sir, find her." Rowan blinked. "Who? Celine?" "No." Adrian dropped his hands. His eyes were red but dry. "Evelina. Find Evelina." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. This silence had texture. It had weight. "Adrian," Rowan said carefully, dropping the title because the moment demanded it. "She's been gone for 7 months. She left the capital the week after you dismissed her from council. No one has seen her. No one knows where she went. She did not take guards. She did not take servants. She walked out of the palace gates with one bag and disappeared. Then look harder. We have been looking. There are rumors, fragments. Some say she went north. Some say she crossed into the free territories. But we have been fighting a war and tracking one woman who does not want to be found. She is not one woman." Adrian's voice cracked on the words, and the crack exposed something raw underneath, something that had been festering. "She is the Luna of Aldenmere. She is my—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "She was my responsibility. And I failed her. I failed her in ways I cannot even count, and I need— He could not finish the sentence. He did not know what he needed. To apologize? To beg? To simply see her face one more time so he could know she was alive, so he could know that the worst thing he ever did had not destroyed the best person he ever knew? Rowan watched him with the careful, steady gaze of a man who had waited a long time for this particular collapse. He had served Adrian for nearly a decade. He had watched the young king transform from a promising leader into a man so consumed by ambition and seduction that he could not see the ground crumbling beneath his own feet. He had watched Celine wrap herself around the throne like ivy around a dying tree, and he had watched Evelina stand in the shadows with her warnings and her quiet dignity and her unbreakable refusal to pretend that everything was fine when it was not. Rowan had never said any of this out loud because he valued his position and his head, but he had thought it every single day for the last 2 years, and there was a very small, very human part of him that felt something close to grim satisfaction watching Adrian finally choke on the consequences of his own arrogance. But satisfaction was a luxury neither of them could afford right now. "I will send scouts," Rowan said, "north and east." Quietly. "But Adrian, the kingdom is falling apart. The people are starving. The lords are circling like wolves. Celine took everything we had left. If we do not act in the next 48 hours, there will not be a kingdom for anyone to come back to." Adrian stared at the cracked wolf emblem on the armrest beneath his hand. The wolf had been the symbol of the Vale dynasty for 300 years. It was supposed to represent strength, loyalty, the bond between ruler and realm. Now it was split down the middle, and Adrian thought that was probably the most honest thing in the entire palace. "Then we act," he said. "We call what allies we have left. We open the armory. We ration what food remains, and we send word to every village in Aldenmere that the crown still stands. And if they do not believe it, then I ride out myself and I prove it to them." Rowan studied him for a long moment. "You can barely walk. I can sit a horse, Your Majesty. I said, do not call me that." Adrian stood. The pain in his knee was blinding. a white-hot lance that shot from his kneecap to his hip, but he stood through it, and he did not let his face change. Call me Adrian. Call me a fool. Call me whatever you need to call me, but do not give me a title I have not earned. He limped past Rowan toward the corridor. The torches were burning low, casting long, unsteady shadows on the stone walls. Everything smelled like smoke and damp, and the particular bitter tang of a building that had been through siege. He made it 30 steps before his knee buckled. It happened fast, the way all collapses happen. One moment he was walking, and the next moment the joint simply refused to hold his weight, and he went down hard onto the cold stone floor, catching himself on his hands, but too late to stop his damaged knee from slamming against the ground. The pain was so total, so absolute, that for a full 3 seconds he could not breathe. His vision whited out. Sound disappeared. The world reduced itself to a single screaming point of agony in his left leg. And Adrian Vale, king of Aldenmere, conqueror of the southern front, slayer of Lord Draven's champions, lay on the floor of his own palace corridor like a broken animal and could not get up. Rowan was beside him in an instant, hands under his arms, hauling him upright. Easy, easy. I have you. Adrian's breath came in short, ragged bursts through clenched teeth. Sweat had broken out across his forehead and the back of his neck. He could feel the iron fragment shifting beneath his kneecap, grinding against cartilage, and the sensation was so viscerally wrong that his stomach heaved. Get the surgeon, he gasped. Tonight, get this thing out of my leg tonight. You need rest first. I will rest when I am dead. Adrian gripped Rowan's shoulder and pulled himself upright, swaying, his face the color of old parchment. Get the surgeon, then send the scouts. Then gather whatever officers we have left in the war room at dawn. He paused, breathing hard. And Rowan, Sir, when you send the scouts north, tell them to ask about a woman with red hair and dark eyes who heals people. Tell them to ask about someone who shows up in destroyed places and makes them whole again. Tell them to ask about someone who does not use her real name but cannot stop herself from helping strangers. You think that is how we find her? I know it is. Adrian's voice was raw, scraped down to something honest and terrible. Because that is who she is. That is who she has always been. She could not stop helping people if she tried. It is the thing I loved most about her, and the thing I punished her for most severely. And if there is any justice left in this rotting world, it will be the thing that leads me back to her. Rowan nodded. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that there might not be any justice left, and that even if they found her, the Evelina Ashford who walked out of this palace 7 months ago was probably not the same woman who would be standing at the end of that road. People who are broken by the ones they love do not simply wait around to be found. They rebuild. They harden. They become someone new. And that someone new does not always want to look backward. But Rowan kept his mouth shut and helped his king limp down the corridor, and the torches guttered behind them as if the palace itself was losing the will to stay lit. The surgery happened at midnight in a cold room below the kitchens that had been converted into a field hospital during the siege. The surgeon was a woman named Thera Voss, mid-50s, with hands that were too steady for the amount of blood she had seen in the last 3 months, and eyes that held the flat, professional detachment of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by the creative ways human beings could damage each other. She laid Adrian on a wooden table that was too short for his frame so that his feet hung off the end. 2 soldiers held torches above them, and the light was uneven and harsh and threw sharp shadows across Adrian's face as he stared at the ceiling and tried to control his breathing. I can give you something for the pain, Thera said, laying out her instruments on a cloth beside him. But it will put you to sleep for hours, and I understand you have business at dawn. Just do it. Thera looked at him. Your Majesty, I have pulled iron from a lot of men. The ones who say just do it are always the ones who scream the loudest. Then I will scream. Adrian turned his head and looked at her directly. But I will be awake when you are finished, and I will walk out of this room on my own legs. Do it. Thera held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of work. She pressed her fingers around Adrian's knee, probing, and even that gentle pressure made him hiss through his teeth. It is deep, she murmured, lodged against the inner edge of the patella. I can feel it. She looked at the soldiers. Hold him. They gripped his shoulders and his good leg, and Thera made her first cut, and Adrian's world became a red, howling thing that he could only endure by biting down on the leather strap she had placed between his teeth and focusing every remaining shred of his consciousness on a single image in his mind, Evelina. Standing in the garden behind the palace, the morning after their bonding ceremony, with sunlight in her hair and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and her eyes, those dark, serious, beautiful eyes, looking at him with a kind of hope so raw and unguarded that it had almost frightened him. She had said to him that morning, "I know this is not the life you imagined. I know I am not the choice you would have made. But I am here, Adrian. I am here and I will not leave." And he had smiled at her and said something polite and meaningless, and then spent the rest of the day in council meetings where Celine sat across the table and made him feel like the most powerful man alive with nothing more than a look. He had wasted her. He had wasted the best thing that ever happened to him with the casual, thoughtless cruelty of a man who assumed good things would always be there when he decided he wanted them. Thera pulled the iron free. It came out with a wet, sucking sound that Adrian felt in his bones, and the pain peaked so high that his vision went black for a full second before crashing back to the torchlit room. "Got it," Thera said, holding up a twisted piece of dark metal the size of a thumbnail. She dropped it into a metal bowl with a clang that echoed in the small room. "The wound needs packing and stitching. 12 days minimum before you put weight on it. I am writing at dawn." Thera looked at him like he was an idiot, which, in fairness, he was. "If you write at dawn, the wound will reopen within the hour. If it gets infected, you lose the leg. If you lose the leg, you lose the war. Is your pride worth a limb?" Adrian lay there panting, covered in sweat, with blood running down his left leg and pooling on the table beneath him. The torchlight made his iron-gray eyes look almost silver, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like a wounded wolf backed into a corner, all teeth and desperation and the absolute refusal to lie down and die. "Give me 3 days," he said. "Stitch it, pack it, brace it. I will take 3 days. Then I ride." Thera sewed him up in silence. When she finished, she wrapped the knee in heavy linen and secured it with a wooden brace that ran from mid-thigh to mid-shin. Adrian sat up slowly, swung his legs off the table, and placed his feet on the floor. The pain was still enormous, but it was a different shape now, cleaner. The grinding was gone. The foreign object that had been tearing him apart from the inside was sitting in a bowl on the table, small and insignificant and utterly disproportionate to the damage it had caused. He thought about that for longer than he should have. 3 days, Thera repeated, pointing at him with a bloody instrument. 3 days, or I will have Rowan tie you to a bed. Adrian almost smiled. It was a ghost of a thing, barely a twitch at the corner of his mouth, but it was there. "Thank you, Thera." She grunted and turned back to her instruments, and Adrian limped out of the room with his brace clicking against the stone floor and his mind already churning through the wreckage of his kingdom, sorting rubble into piles, trying to find anything worth salvaging. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his chambers, which had been ransacked during the siege and only partially restored, and he went through every document, every ledger, every report that remained in the palace. The picture they painted was devastating. Celine had not just stolen the emergency reserves. She had been siphoning funds for months, redirecting tax revenues, falsifying trade reports, building a financial escape route so thorough and so well disguised that it would have made a master forger weep with admiration. And she had done all of it while sleeping beside him, while whispering strategy in his ear, while sitting in councils and smiling that devastating smile and making every man in the room feel like he was the only one she was really talking to. He found one document that nearly broke him, a letter written in Evelina's handwriting, dated 5 months before she left. It had been addressed to him but never delivered. He found it wedged behind a drawer in the desk that Celine had used as her personal workspace. "Adrian," the letter read, "I know you will not listen to this because you have not listened to anything I have said in a very long time, but I am writing it anyway because I need you to know that I tried. The accounts do not balance. The Southern trade revenues are 60% lower than what Celine reports to council, but the expenditure records show full allocation. The money is going somewhere, Adrian. It is disappearing, and I can show you exactly where if you would give me 1 hour. 1 hour is all I am asking for. Not as your Luna, not as your wife, just as someone who does not want to watch everything you built fall apart because you trusted the wrong person. I am not jealous. I am not bitter. I am terrified for you and for this kingdom, and I do not know how to make you hear me when you have decided I have nothing worth hearing. Evelina. Adrian read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, close to his chest. And he sat in the guttering candlelight of his ransacked chambers, and he breathed through a grief so enormous that it filled every corner of the room and left no space for anything else. She had tried to save him. She had tried and tried and tried, and he had shut her out every single time, because a beautiful woman with a sharper smile and a better understanding of male ego had made it so easy to believe that loyalty was boring and ambition was love. The candle burned down to nothing. Dawn came gray and cold and merciless through the broken windows. And Adrian sat exactly where he had been all night, with the letter against his chest and the ruins of his kingdom spread across the desk in front of him. And he understood for the first time in his life that the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced was not Lord Draven or the Southern rebels, or even Celine. It was himself. It had always been himself. He heard boots in this corridor. Rowan appeared in the doorway, and his face was different this morning, tighter, more urgent. "What is it?" Adrian said. Rowan stepped inside and closed the door. "The scouts I sent north 3 hours ago just came back." "Already?" "They did not have to go far." Rowan's voice was strained, pulled taut like a wire about to snap. "There's a man at the gate. He rode through the night from the northern highlands. He says he has a message, and he will deliver it only to the king." "Who is he?" "He says his name is Lucian Ward." Adrian went still. "He says he is a commander of the Highland militia. He says he knows where Evelina is. And he says—" Rowan paused, and in that pause, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "He says, if you want to see her, you will have to go through him first." The silence that followed was so complete that Adrian could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through his veins, could hear the distant sound of wind through shattered glass, and the faint, maddening drip of rainwater falling onto stone somewhere deep in the bones of his dying palace. He stood up. The brace on his knee groaned. His body screamed. "Bring him in," Adrian said. And somewhere, far to the north, in a place Adrian could not yet see or reach or imagine, Evelina Ashford opened her eyes to a cold mountain dawn and placed her hand against the swell of her stomach, where a new heartbeat, small, fierce, and secret, was just beginning to make itself known. The door opened and Lucian Ward walked into the throne room like a man who had never once in his life asked permission to enter anywhere. He was tall. That was the first thing Adrian noticed, and he hated himself for noticing it because it was such a small, petty thing to care about when his kingdom was collapsing around him, but the animal part of his brain cataloged it instantly and filed it under threat. Lucian Ward was tall, broad across the shoulders, narrow at the waist, built the way men are built when their muscles come from actual labor instead of tournament training. His skin was weathered dark from years in the Highland sun and wind. His hair was the color of damp sand, cut short and practical. And his jaw carried a scar that ran from just below his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a white line against brown skin that gave his face a permanent look of having survived something that should have killed him. But it was his eyes that stopped Adrian cold. They were green, not the soft, decorative green of palace gardens, but the hard, flat green of deep water over stone, the kind of green that did not invite and did not warm and did not give a single damn whether you found it beautiful or not. Those eyes swept the ruined throne room with a soldier's efficiency, cataloging exits, measuring distances, counting the guards Rowan had posted along the walls, and then they settled on Adrian with the focused, unhurried weight of a man who had already decided exactly how this conversation was going to go. Lucian did not bow. Adrian felt the absence of that bow in his sternum like a missing heartbeat. Every person who had entered this room for 300 years had bent at the waist before addressing the throne. Servants, lords, generals, ambassadors, enemies who had been dragged here in chains, all of them had bowed, because that was what the room demanded, what the throne compelled, what the weight of the Vale dynasty required. Lucian Ward stood straight as a pike and looked Adrian in the eye, and the silence between them filled with something that was older than politics and more dangerous than war. Rowan stepped forward. "Commander Ward, you stand before King Adrian Vale of Aldenmere. You will show—" "I know who he is." Lucian's voice was low, unhurried, with a slight roughness at the edges like gravel under boots. He did not look at Rowan. He kept his eyes on Adrian, the way a man keeps his eyes on a snake he has found in his path. I did not ride through the night to learn his name. Adrian studied him from the broken throne. His left knee throbbed inside its brace. His hands rested on the armrests, one whole and one cracked, and he was acutely aware that he looked like exactly what he was, a beaten man sitting in the wreckage of everything he once controlled. "You said you have a message," Adrian said. His voice was steady. He made sure of that. "Deliver it." Lucien reached into the leather satchel slung across his chest and produced a folded piece of paper. He did not step forward to hand it over. He held it at his side, and the gesture was so deliberate, so clearly a refusal to approach the throne, that Rowan's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword. "Before I give you this," Lucien said, "I need you to understand something. I did not come here as your subject. I do not recognize your authority over the Northern Highlands. I came because she asked me to, and she is the only authority I answer to." The word she landed in the room like a dropped blade. Adrian's pulse spiked. He felt it in his throat, in the veins at his temples, in the hot electric rush of blood through his damaged body. She, Evelina. This man had just walked into his throne room and said she in a voice that carried ownership, and every territorial instinct Adrian possessed fired at once like a volley of arrows hitting the same target. He leaned forward on the throne. His knee screamed. He did not care. "You are talking about my Luna." Something changed in Lucien's face. It was not anger exactly. It was something colder, something that had been refined by months of proximity to a woman's pain until it had become a kind of quiet, lethal certainty. "I am talking about Evelina Ashford." Lucien's jaw tightened, and she stopped being yours the night you chose another woman over her in front of your entire court. She stopped being yours when you let her walk out of this palace alone, with nothing, in the middle of a kingdom tearing itself apart. She stopped being yours 7 months ago, and the fact that you are only now saying her name tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man sits on that throne. The guards along the walls shifted. Rowan's knuckles were white on his sword hilt. The air in the room had become something you could chew on, thick and volatile and waiting for a spark. Adrian's chest was doing something he could not control. It was tightening, constricting, as if the bones of his ribcage were slowly closing around his lungs. He recognized what was happening because it had been happening in smaller, quieter ways for weeks now. Every time he thought about Evelina, every time her face surfaced in the dark water of his memory. It was grief, and it was shame, and it was the particular agony of hearing another man speak about the woman you destroyed with more tenderness and more right than you ever possessed yourself. But there was something else there too, something hotter, something that lived in the base of his spine and the hinges of his jaw. It was the instinct that said, "This is mine," that roared against the simple biological reality of another male standing in his territory claiming what belonged to him. Adrian knew this instinct was irrational. He knew it was the exact same blind, possessive stupidity that had driven him to Celine in the first place, the need to dominate, to control, to hold everything in his fist whether he deserved it or not. But knowing a thing and feeling a thing are not the same, and right now the feeling was winning. "Where is she?" Adrian said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, and it was more dangerous at that volume than it had ever been at a shout. "She is safe." "That is not what I asked." "It is the only answer you are getting." Lucien held up the folded paper. "She wrote you this. She said you would understand. She also said, and this is from her, not from me, that if you come north, you come alone, you come unarmed, and you come ready to listen instead of command. If you cannot do those 3 things, do not come at all." He tossed the paper. It sailed through the air in a slow arc and landed on the stone floor between them, and neither man moved to pick it up. The silence stretched. Rowan looked between them. 2 soldiers by the eastern wall exchanged glances. Outside, the wind picked up and howled through the shattered stained glass, scattering colored fragments across the floor with a sound like tiny bones breaking. Adrian spoke first. "You are a commander of the Highland militia." "I am." "How many soldiers?" "Enough." Adrian almost smiled, and it was the ugliest smile Rowan had ever seen on a human face. "Enough. You walk into my throne room, refuse to bow, speak my Luna's name like it belongs in your mouth, and when I ask about your military strength, you say enough." He paused. "You are either very brave or very stupid, Commander Ward." Lucian tilted his head slightly. The scar on his jaw caught the gray light from the broken windows. There is a third option. And what is that? That I am a man who spent the last 7 months watching the woman you threw away rebuild herself from nothing. And I am not afraid of anyone who could do what you did to her and still call himself a king. The words hit Adrian in a place that had no armor. He sat back on the throne as if he had been physically pushed, and for a long, terrible moment his face was completely naked. No pride, no authority, no performance. Just a man hearing the truth about himself from a stranger and having nowhere left to hide from it. Rowan stepped forward. That is enough. Commander, you have delivered your message. You can... Let him talk, Adrian said quietly. Rowan stopped. Adrian looked at Lucian, and something in his gaze shifted. The territorial fire was still there, still burning in the deep red center of his chest, but it was being held now, contained by something that might have been the first fragile stirring of an emotion Adrian had very little experience with. Humility. How did you find her? Adrian said. Lucien studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether this version of the question deserved an honest answer. Then he spoke. My patrol found her on the North Road, 40 miles past the border, in the 3rd week after she left your palace. She was walking. No horse, no escort, no supplies. She had a bag with 3 changes of clothes and a medical kit she had assembled from the palace infirmary before she left. Her shoes were worn through. She had blisters on both feet that had broken and bled, and broken again. She was dehydrated. She had not eaten in 2 days. Adrian's hand gripped the cracked armrest so hard that a piece of stone broke off in his palm. He did not notice. We brought her to our outpost. Our field medic treated her feet and gave her food and water. She did not speak for the first 2 days. Not a word. She sat in the corner of the barracks and she stared at the wall and she breathed, and that was all she did. And I have seen men come back from the worst battles of my career with more life in their eyes than she had in hers. Stop, Adrian said. Lucian did not stop. On the 3rd day, she got up. She walked out of the barracks, and she found a village that had been hit by raiders the week before. 14 houses burned. 30 people displaced. No food, no shelter, no help coming because the crown, your crown, was too busy fighting a war in the south to notice that its own people were dying in the north. She walked into that village and she started working. She organized the survivors. She set up a medical station with the kit she had carried out of your palace. She rationed what food my soldiers could spare. She held a woman's hand while that woman died from an infected burn wound because there was no surgeon and no medicine, and no one in the entire kingdom who gave a damn. I said, stop, and she never cried. Lucian's voice was quiet, but it filled the room like smoke. Not once. Not in front of anyone. She worked 18 hours a day for 2 weeks straight, and she rebuilt that village, and when it was done, she moved to the next one, and the next one after that, and she has not stopped since. She has rebuilt 4 communities in 7 months. 4. With nothing. No army, no treasury, no royal decree. Just her hands and her will and the kind of stubborn, furious compassion that cannot be taught. The room was silent. Adrian was not moving. He was sitting on the throne with the broken piece of stone still in his palm, and his face was the color of ash, and his breathing had become shallow and uneven, and there was a brightness in his iron-gray eyes that could have been rage or grief, or something so tangled between the two that even he could not separate them. Lucien exhaled slowly. That is who you threw away. That is who you humiliated in front of your court. That is who you replaced with a woman who robbed you blind and disappeared. So when I stand here and I do not bow, it is not because I do not understand what a king is. It is because I understand exactly what a king is, and I am looking at a man who does not qualify. Rowan drew his sword. It was a reflex, pure and instinctive, the sound of steel clearing the scabbard ringing through the throne room like a bell. 2 guards moved forward from the walls. Adrian raised his hand. Everyone stopped. The moment balanced on a razor's edge. Rowan stood with his blade half raised, sweat on his upper lip. The guards were frozen mid-step. Lucien had not moved at all. He stood exactly where he had been since he entered the room, feet planted, shoulders square, those flat green eyes steady on Adrian's face with the absolute calm of a man who had made peace with every possible outcome of this conversation before he ever walked through the gates. "Put it away, Rowan," Adrian said. "He is—" "Put it away." Rowan sheathed his sword. The sound of it sliding home was like a door closing. Adrian looked at the folded paper on the floor between them. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood from the throne, and the movement cost him something visible. His face tightened, his breath caught. His damaged knee protested with a grinding pop that was audible in the silent room, and he walked down from the raised platform, one step at a time, his brace clicking against the stone. He stopped in front of Lucian. They were close enough that Adrian could see the individual threads of the scar on the commander's jaw, could smell road dust and horse sweat, and the cold pine scent of the northern highlands on his clothes. Adrian bent down and picked up the letter. He unfolded it. Evelina's handwriting. He would have known it anywhere, the clean, precise strokes, the slight leftward lean, the way she dotted her letters with small, deliberate points instead of casual flicks. His eyes moved across the words and his face changed as he read, changed in ways that were small and devastating, the way a landscape changes when the light shifts, and suddenly you can see every crack and shadow that was hidden before. "She wants to meet," Adrian said. His voice was barely a sound. "On her terms," Lucian said. Adrian folded the letter and placed it in the same pocket where he kept the one he had found in Celine's desk. 2 letters from the same woman, written months apart, and between them a gap so vast and so full of his own failures that he could not see the other side. "I will come," Adrian said. "Alone. Alone. Unarmed." Adrian's jaw worked. The territorial thing in his chest flared again, hot and irrational, because this man was dictating terms to a king in his own throne room, and every cell in Adrian's body wanted to assert dominance, wanted to grab the situation by the throat and force it into a shape he could control. But control was what had destroyed everything. Control was the lie he had told himself while Celine emptied his treasury and Evelina walked barefoot into the wilderness with bleeding feet and a broken heart. "Unarmed," Adrian said. "Good." Lucian stepped back. "One step, precise and final. I will wait for you at the northern pass in 4 days. If you are not there by sundown on the 4th day, the offer is withdrawn and she does not ask again." He turned to leave. "Commander." Lucian stopped but did not turn around. Adrian stared at the back of this man's head and fought the hardest battle of his life. Harder than the southern front, harder than the siege, harder than lying on a table while a surgeon dug iron from his knee. He fought the part of himself that wanted to ask the question that was burning a hole through his chest, the question that had nothing to do with kingdoms or alliances or strategy, and everything to do with the raw, savage, ungovernable fact that another man had been there for his woman when he was not. He lost the battle. "Are you in love with her?" Adrian said. Lucian turned his head. Not all the way. Just enough that Adrian could see the edge of his jaw and the line of his scar, and one green eye looking back at him with something that was not cruelty and not pity, but was somehow worse than both. "That is not your question to ask," Lucian said. "Not anymore." Then he walked out of the throne room, and his boots on the stone floor sounded like a countdown, and Adrian stood alone in the middle of that ruined hall with 2 letters pressed against his heart, and the sickening absolute certainty that the answer to his question was yes. Rowan materialized beside him. His face was tight with controlled fury. "You cannot seriously be considering this." "I am not considering it. I am doing it." "Adrian, this is a trap. A man we have never met walks in here, insults you to your face, refuses to disclose his military strength, and invites you to ride alone and unarmed into territory you do not control. This is how kings die." "Maybe." Adrian turned and limped toward the corridor. "Maybe this is how kings die. But doing nothing is how kingdoms die. And I have already proven that I am excellent at doing nothing when it matters." He made it to the corridor before Rowan caught his arm. "Listen to me." Rowan's grip was hard, and his voice was low and urgent. "I have followed you through 9 years and 3 wars and every stupid decision you have ever made, and I have never once asked you to stop. I am asking you now. Not as your captain, as your friend. Do not ride into that pass alone." Adrian looked at the hand on his arm. Then he looked at Rowan's face, at the genuine fear there, the weathered, scarred, stubborn concern of a man who had bled beside him on more battlefields than either of them could count. "Rowan, if Evelina wanted me dead, she would not have sent a letter. She would have sent nothing. She would have let me sit on this broken throne and rot, and she would have been right to do it. The fact that she is willing to see me at all is more mercy than I deserve, and I'm not going to waste it by showing up with soldiers at my back and proving that I have learned nothing. Rowan released his arm. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. Then at least let me ride behind you, half a mile back, out of sight. If something goes wrong, nothing is going to go wrong. You do not know that. Adrian stopped walking. He turned and looked at Rowan, and there was something new in his face, something exhausted and raw and honest in a way that Adrian Vale had never been honest about anything in his entire life. Everything has already gone wrong, Rowan. Everything that could possibly go wrong has gone wrong. I lost my treasury, I lost my allies, I lost my kingdom, and I lost the only woman who ever told me the truth about myself. He paused. His breath was ragged. I am riding into that past because it is the last thing left that I have not destroyed. And if there is even a chance, even the smallest, most pathetic chance, that she will look at me and see something worth saving, then I will crawl there on my hands and knees if I have to. Rowan stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded, once, short and sharp, and he turned and walked toward the barracks without another word. And Adrian knew that Rowan would follow him anyway, half a mile back, out of sight, because that is what loyal men do. They protect the people they care about, whether those people want it or not. Adrian spent the next 3 days preparing his kingdom for the possibility that he would not come back. He dictated letters to the remaining lords, not demanding allegiance but asking for patience. He signed orders transferring emergency military authority to Rowan. He walked the streets of the capital, which was something no Vale king had done in living memory, and he saw his kingdom the way Evelina must have seen it before she left. The collapsed buildings, the hungry faces, the children playing in rubble because there was nowhere else to play. He stopped in front of a bakery that had been gutted during the siege. An old woman was sitting on the remains of the front step, sorting through broken bricks with slow, arthritic hands. "What are you doing?" Adrian asked. She looked up at him. She did not recognize him. His crown was locked away, his royal clothing long since traded for practical riding gear, and the man standing before her looked less like a king and more like a soldier who had been through something terrible and come out the other side leaner and quieter and fundamentally changed. "Rebuilding," she said. "What does it look like?" Adrian looked at the pile of bricks. Half of them were cracked. The mortar was gone. There was no frame, no tools, no foundation left. "With these," he said. The old woman squinted at him. "You wait for someone else to bring you better bricks. You die waiting. You use what you got. You make it work." She picked up a cracked brick and set it carefully beside another one. That is how things get built. Not by people with perfect materials, by people who refuse to sit still. Adrian stood there on the broken street with his brace clicking and his knee aching and the cold wind cutting through his coat, and he heard Evelina in that old woman's words as clearly as if she were standing beside him. That was who Evelina had always been. The person who refused to sit still. The person who picked up broken things and made them work. She had tried to do that with his kingdom. She had tried to do that with him. And he had told her, in front of everyone who mattered, that her efforts were not welcome. He helped the old woman sort bricks for an hour. His knees screamed, his stitches pulled, sweat ran down his back despite the cold. And when he finally straightened up and looked at the small, pathetic row of salvaged bricks they had assembled together, it was the most honest work he had done since he took the crown. On the morning of the 4th day, Adrian rode north. He rode alone on a gray horse that had survived the war, with the same grim endurance as its rider. The brace on his knee made mounting awkward and painful, and the first hour of riding was an exercise in pure, jaw-clenching stubbornness as the motion of the horse jarred his wound with every stride. He carried no weapon. He carried no banner. He wore no crown and no insignia, and nothing that identified him as anything other than a man on a horse riding toward something that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. The road north wound through the wreckage of his kingdom. He passed villages that had been burned and abandoned. He passed fields that had been trampled by cavalry charges and never replanted. He passed a bridge that had collapsed during the war and been rebuilt with rough timber and rope by people who had no engineers and no help, and no reason to believe anyone was coming to save them. At every ruined village, he slowed his horse and looked. Really looked. Not the way a king surveys his territory, calculating value and strategic position, But the way a man looks at damage, he knows he caused. He saw the scorch marks on stone walls. He saw the empty market squares. He saw the shallow graves by the roadside, marked with nothing but stacked stones because there had been no one left to carve proper markers. This was what Evelina had walked through, alone, on bleeding feet, with nothing but a medical kit and whatever was left of her shattered heart. She had walked through this devastation, and instead of collapsing under the weight of it, she had started fixing it. Adrian rode through the second day and into the night. He stopped only when the horse needed rest and he could not trust his own balance in the saddle anymore. He slept on the ground beside the road wrapped in a single blanket, staring at stars he had not bothered to look at in years, and he thought about things he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. He thought about the morning of his bonding ceremony with Evelina. He had been 24. She had been 22. The ceremony had been arranged by their families for political advantage. The Vales needed the Ashford territory, and the Ashfords needed royal protection, and neither Adrian nor Evelina had been consulted about whether they wanted to spend their lives together. But Evelina had tried. That was the thing that gutted him now, lying on the cold ground with his ruined knee and his empty kingdom. She had tried so hard. She had learned the names of every servant in the palace. She had studied trade policy and military logistics and agricultural planning. She had sat in council meetings and taken notes and asked questions that were smarter than anything the lords were saying. She had reached for him again and again, in quiet moments, in private, with a kind of determined, hopeful vulnerability that should have moved any man with a beating heart. And Adrian had let Celine pull him away every single time, because Celine was fire and Evelina was warmth, and a young, arrogant king could not tell the difference between something that burned him and something that sustained him. He reached the northern pass on the evening of the fourth day. The highlands rose around him like the walls of a cathedral built by something older and more patient than human hands. The air was thin and cold and tasted like pine and stone and the faint mineral tang of distant snow. The road narrowed to a single track between two granite ridges, and at the mouth of that track, sitting on a boulder with his arms resting on his knees, was Lucian Ward. The commander looked different in his own territory, more settled, more dangerous. He rose when he saw Adrian approach, and his green eyes took in the lone rider, the weaponless belt, the brace on the knee, and something in his posture shifted from defensive alertness to a kind of grudging acknowledgement. "You came alone," Lucian said. "I said I would." Lucian studied him for a moment. Then he nodded and turned toward the narrow track. "Follow me. The path is rough. Your horse will manage if you keep her steady." They rode in silence through the pass, and the granite walls rose higher on either side until the sky was just a narrow strip of darkening blue above them. The sound of the horse's hooves on stone echoed in the confined space, and Adrian could hear water running somewhere beneath them, an underground stream carving its patient way through the mountain. They emerged on the other side into a valley that stopped Adrian's breath. It was small, sheltered on three sides by mountain ridges, with a river running through its center that caught the last of the sunset and turned it to liquid copper. There were houses here, simple but sturdy structures of stone and timber, arranged around a central square. Smoke rose from chimneys, lanterns were being lit in windows. He could hear voices, laughter, the sound of someone hammering metal in a forge, the bark of a dog. It was alive. In a kingdom full of ruin and silence and death, this place was alive. Lucian dismounted and gestured for Adrian to do the same. "She's in the healing house, the stone building on the eastern edge of the square. She knows you're coming." Adrian dismounted. The impact of landing sent a bolt of pain through his knee that made his vision pulse. But he steadied himself against the horse's flank and breathed through it. He looked at the stone building across the square. Warm light spilled from its windows. The door was open. And standing in that doorway, backlit by firelight, was a silhouette he would have known from 1,000 miles away. Slender. Still. Hair that caught the last light and held it like dying embers. His heart stopped. Not metaphorically, not poetically. His actual heart skipped a beat, stuttered, then slammed back to life with a force that rocked him on his feet. His mouth went dry. His hands began to shake. Every thought in his head evaporated and was replaced by a single, devastating recognition. She was there. She was real. She was alive and standing 50 feet away from him in a place she had built from nothing while he sat on a broken throne and felt sorry for himself. Adrian took a step forward. Lucien's hand closed around his arm, hard, not violent, just immovable. Adrian turned his head. Lucien's face was very close, and those green eyes were burning with something that was not anger, but was just as hot. "Listen to me carefully," Lucien said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "She agreed to see you because she believes people deserve the chance to face the consequences of what they have done. Not because she misses you, not because she needs you, not because she has been waiting for you to come to your senses. She has nightmares, Adrian. She wakes up screaming your name, and it is not because she wants you there. It is because in her dreams, you are still the man who stood in front of a room full of people and told her she was not enough." Lucien released his arm. "So when you walk through that door, you walk in knowing that you did this. You own every second of what you are about to feel. And if you hurt her again, by word, by look, by the tone of your voice, I will not need a weapon to end you. Are we clear?" Adrian looked at him. Two men standing in the mountain dusk, one who had destroyed something precious, and one who had picked up the pieces. And between them, the kind of understanding that does not require words because it lives in the body, in the blood, in the ancient wiring that connects the chest to the fist. "We are clear," Adrian said. He turned and walked toward the healing house. 50 feet, 40, 30. Each step took longer than the one before because the closer he got, the more detail he could see. And every detail was a knife. She was thinner than he remembered. Her hair was longer, pulled back in a simple braid that hung over one shoulder. She was wearing rough Highland clothing, wool and leather, nothing like the silk she had worn at court. Her hands were at her sides, and they were not the soft, pale hands of a queen. They were calloused and work-roughened, with short nails and small scars on the knuckles. The hands of a woman who had been building things with them every single day. And her face. Her face was the thing that almost dropped him to his knees right there in the square. It was the same face, the same dark eyes, the same high cheekbones, the same mouth that rarely smiled. But something fundamental had changed in the architecture beneath those features. Some internal restructuring that had shifted everything just enough to make her look like a different person. The softness was gone. The hope was gone. The quiet, determined vulnerability that had once made her reach for him across council tables and through closed doors and across all the distances he kept putting between them, that was gone. What remained was something harder, something forged in the particular furnace of being broken by someone you loved and choosing to rebuild yourself without them. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, not unburned but unsurprised, as if she had always suspected the flames were coming and had simply been waiting to prove she could survive them. She looked at him from the doorway, and her face did not change. No shock, no tears, no anger, nothing. And that nothing was worse than anything Adrian had ever faced on a battlefield. Because rage he could answer, and grief he could hold, and hatred he could fight. But this calm, settled, absolute absence of need, this was the sound of a door that had been closed so completely that the room behind it no longer existed. Adrian stopped 10 feet from the door. "Evelina," he said. And Evelina Ashford, the woman he had abandoned, the Luna he had humiliated, the only person who had ever tried to tell him the truth, looked at the man who had once been her entire world and said, in a voice as steady and as cold as mountain stone, "You are late, Adrian, by about a year." Then she stepped aside from the doorway, not toward him, just aside, leaving the entrance open like an invitation that carried no warmth, and the firelight behind her caught something Adrian had not been able to see from across the square. The slight, unmistakable curve of her lower belly beneath the rough wool of her Highland clothing. Adrian's legs stopped working. His vision tunneled. Sound disappeared. The world collapsed to a single, impossible point. The shape of her body in the firelight, the thing it meant, the life it contained. And the ground beneath his feet might as well have opened up and swallowed him whole, because in that moment Adrian Vale understood with total annihilating clarity that Evelina had not just left him. She had taken the future with her, and he had no idea whose future it was. Adrian did not know how long he stood there. Time had become unreliable, stretching and collapsing like a lung that could not decide whether to breathe in or out. The firelight from the healing house doorway painted Evelina in warm amber and threw her shadow long across the stone square behind her, and that shadow touched Adrian's boots like a ghost reaching for something it could no longer hold. The curve of her belly, the impossible, devastating geometry of new life pressing against rough wool. His mind was doing arithmetic it did not want to do. 7 months since she left the palace. 7 months since she walked out of those gates with one bag and bleeding feet. The math could go either way, and both directions led to places that would destroy him differently. If the child was his, then he had driven a pregnant woman into the wilderness alone. If the child was not his, then she had found someone worthy of what he had thrown away, and the replacement had happened with a speed that told him exactly how little she had left to mourn. Either answer was a blade. He just did not know which edge he was standing on. Evelina watched him from the doorway with those dark, steady eyes, and she saw the exact moment his gaze dropped to her stomach, and she saw the exact moment his brain caught up to what his eyes were telling him, and she did not flinch. She did not cover herself or turn away or offer explanation. She stood in that doorway like a woman who had long ago stopped arranging herself around the reactions of the man in front of her. "Come inside," she said. "You look like you are about to fall over." Adrian's legs obeyed before his mind could form a coherent objection. He walked through the doorway into the healing house, and the warmth hit him like a wall. After 4 days of cold roads and colder ground, and the particular chill that lives inside a man who is riding toward something he knows he does not deserve, the simple heat of a well-fed fire in a closed room was almost overwhelming. The healing house was a single large room with stone walls and a timber ceiling. There were 6 cots along the far wall, 2 of them occupied by sleeping figures. Shelves lined the near wall, stacked with jars and bottles and bundled herbs and rolled bandages. Everything was organized with a precision that Adrian recognized immediately because it was the same precision Evelina had brought to every task she had ever touched. The same meticulous, stubborn insistence on order that had once made him dismiss her as rigid. She had not been rigid. She had been prepared. There was a difference he had not possessed the intelligence to see. Evelina moved to a wooden table in the center of the room and lowered herself into a chair with the careful, deliberate motion of a woman whose center of gravity had shifted in ways she was still adjusting to. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down before your knee gives out. I can hear the brace grinding from here." Adrian sat. The chair was hard and simple and exactly the right height, and when his weight settled and his knees straightened, the relief was so immediate that his breath left him in a long, shuddering exhale that he could not control and did not try to. They sat across from each other at the wooden table in the warm room, with the fire crackling and the 2 sleeping patients breathing softly on their cots and the mountain dark pressing against the windows. And the distance between them was 3 feet of scarred oak and approximately 1 million miles of everything Adrian had done wrong. He looked at her. Really looked. The way he should have looked at her every single day of their bonding and never once did. The firelight moved across her face and showed him things he had been too blind and too selfish and too consumed by Celine's manufactured brilliance to notice when he had the chance. She was beautiful. Not the way Celine was beautiful, not the way a weapon is beautiful when the light catches its edge, but the way a landscape is beautiful after a storm, stripped down to its essential features, everything unnecessary washed away. Her cheekbones were sharper than he remembered. The skin beneath her eyes was thin and bruised with exhaustion. There were new lines at the corners of her mouth, fine creases that spoke of months of clenching her jaw against pain she refused to vocalize. But her eyes, those dark, serious, unflinching eyes, they were the same and they were completely different. The same color, the same shape, the same direct way of looking at a thing without decoration or excuse. But the quality of the gaze had changed. Before, when she looked at him, there had always been a question in it, a searching, a hope, is there still something here that had made her vulnerable and that he had exploited without ever consciously deciding to exploit it? That question was gone, replaced by a settled, quiet certainty that needed nothing from him and expected less. "You look terrible," she said. "I know. Your knee is worse than they told you. How do you know what they told me?" "Because I know military surgeons. They always understate the damage because they need you functional." She tilted her head slightly. "You rode 4 days on it. The wound has reopened. I can see the blood through your trousers." Adrian looked down. She was right. A dark stain had spread across the fabric below his left knee, slow and steady. The kind of bleeding that was not dramatic enough to alarm, but persistent enough to drain. It is fine. It is not fine. Nothing about you has been fine for a very long time, Adrian, and saying the word does not make it true. The observation landed with the flat, devastating accuracy of a thrown knife. Adrian absorbed it the way he had absorbed Lucian's words in the throne room, the way he had absorbed the empty treasury and the defecting lords and every other consequence of his catastrophic judgment, silently, without defense. Because there was no defense left. "You read my letter," Evelina said, "both of them." Her expression shifted, barely, a flicker of something that came and went too fast to name. "Both. I found the one you wrote about the accounts, the one you tried to send me 5 months before you left. It was behind a drawer in Celine's desk." Evelina was quiet for a moment. Then she exhaled, and the sound was not a sigh but something older, something that had been compressed inside her for a very long time and was finally allowed to escape. "I wrote that letter 4 times, she said. "The first 3 versions were angry. They said things I wanted to say, but knew you would use as proof that I was emotional and therefore unreliable. So I wrote a 4th version that was nothing but facts and numbers and a request for 1 hour of your time." She paused. "You never saw it. Celine buried it. Celine buried everything." Evelina's voice did not rise. It stayed level, calm, factual, which made it infinitely worse than shouting. She intercepted my correspondence. She reassigned my staff. She told the council clerks that I was to be excluded from financial briefings for my own well-being because the stress was affecting my health. She built a wall between me and every source of information I had. And she did it so gradually and so skillfully that by the time I realized what was happening, I was already invisible. Adrian's hands were flat on the table. He could see them shaking. Fine tremors running through his fingers. The kind of shaking that comes not from cold, but from the sustained effort of holding very still when every nerve in the body is screaming. "Why did you not come to me directly?" Evelina looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, something hot moved behind her eyes. Something that was not calm and not settled and not indifferent, but was instead the molten core of a fury so old and so deep that she had learned to live on top of it the way people learn to live on top of active volcanoes, knowing the eruption is inevitable, but choosing each day to plant gardens anyway. "I did come to you directly," she said. 17 times. I have counted. 17 times I came to your chambers, to your study, to the council room, to the gardens, to every place I thought I might find you alone and willing to listen. 9 of those times, Celine was already there. 4 of those times, your guards told me you had asked not to be disturbed. 3 of those times, I made it into the room and started talking, and you cut me off before I finished my first sentence. And once, Adrian, I came to your chambers at midnight because I had finally assembled the proof, the ledgers, the forged entries, the routing numbers, everything. And I knocked on your door, and you opened it, and Celine was behind you in your bed, and you looked at me the way you would look at a servant who had interrupted something important. Adrian closed his eyes. You said, and I remember every word because they are branded into me. You said, "Evelina, this is not a good time." The fire crackled. One of the patients on the far cots shifted in their sleep and made a small sound, and the sound was so fragile and so human in the charged silence of the room that it felt like a reminder that the world contained things other than the wreckage these 2 people had made of each other. "I stood in that hallway," Evelina continued, "with proof of treason in my hands, and you closed the door in my face so you could go back to the woman who was robbing you blind. And I stood there for, I do not know how long, a minute, an hour. I stood there and I realized that it did not matter what I had found. It did not matter what I could prove. Because the problem was never evidence. The problem was that you had decided I was not worth listening to. And no amount of proof can overcome a man's decision to disbelieve you." Adrian opened his eyes. They were wet. He did not wipe them. "That was the night I started planning to leave," Evelina said. "Not because of Celine, not because of the affair, because standing in that hallway, I understood something about survival that I had been refusing to accept." She leaned forward slightly, and the firelight caught the hard planes of her face and the dark steadiness of her eyes. "I understood that loyalty to someone who does not value it is not loyalty. It is self-destruction." and I was done destroying myself for you." The words hung in the warm room like smoke. Adrian sat with them. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not reach for the 1,000 justifications that his mind had been manufacturing during 4 days of riding, the mitigating circumstances, the pressures of ruling, the fog of war, the intoxication of Celine's manipulation. He sat with the naked, unadorned reality of what Evelina was telling him, and he let it cut. Because she was right. Every word she said was right, and the rightness of it was the most painful thing he had ever experienced, more painful than the iron in his knee, more painful than the empty treasury, more painful than watching his kingdom crumble. Because those losses were external. They happened to him. But this, what he had done to Evelina, this was something he had built with his own hands, brick by brick, dismissal by dismissal, closed door by closed door. And there was no one else to blame and nowhere else to put the weight. "I know," he said. His voice cracked on the second word and he let it crack. "I know." Evelina watched the crack in his voice with the clinical attention of a healer assessing a wound, measuring its depth, calculating how much damage lay beneath the surface. "Why are you here, Adrian?" He took a breath. It stuttered in his chest like a wheel on broken ground. "Because I need—" "Stop." The word was so sharp and so sudden that Adrian's mouth closed on reflex. "Do not say you need me," Evelina said. "Do not say you need my help, my counsel, my forgiveness, my return. Do not frame this in terms of your needs. You have had 31 years of your needs being the only ones that matter, and I am done being a resource you reach for when your other resources run out." Adrian sat very still. The rebuke landed like a physical blow, and something inside his chest that had been holding together through sheer stubborn will began to fracture. Not break. Fracture. The way stone fractures, along lines of stress that have been building for years under invisible pressure, lines that were always there but only become visible when the load finally exceeds the material's capacity to pretend it is still whole. "Then tell me what to say," he whispered. "I should not have to tell you what to say. That is the entire problem. You have never known what to say to me without someone scripting it for you. The cruelty of the observation was its accuracy. Adrian absorbed it and tasted something bitter at the back of his throat, the bile of a man swallowing truths he has spent years refusing to eat. Evelina pushed back from the table and stood. The movement was slow and careful, one hand briefly pressing against her lower belly in an unconscious gesture of protection that Adrian watched with a hunger so sharp it bordered on physical pain. She walked to the shelves along the wall and began organizing bottles that were already perfectly organized, and he recognized the behavior because he had seen her do it 100 times at the palace, the nervous sorting, the need to do something with her hands when the thing she really needed to do was scream. Adrian stood too. His knee protested violently and he ignored it. "Evelina." She did not turn around. "The child," he said, and the word came out rough and raw and terrified. "Is it—" "Mine," she said. "The child is mine. That is not what I am asking." "I know what you are asking." She turned then, and her face was a fortress. "And the answer is that it does not matter. Whether this child shares your blood or not, you have no claim. You forfeited every claim you had when you chose to build your life around a woman who was dismantling it. This child will be born in these highlands, surrounded by people who showed up when you did not. And it will know what loyalty looks like because it will grow up watching people who practice it instead of people who just demand it." Adrian's vision blurred. He blinked and something hot ran down his left cheek, and he realized he was crying, actually crying, standing in a highland healing house with a broken knee and a broken kingdom and a broken everything, and the tears felt foreign on his face because Adrian Vale had not cried since he was 11 years old, and his father had beaten that particular weakness out of him with the back of his hand, and the words, "Kings do not weep." But his father was dead, and his crown was meaningless, and the woman in front of him was carrying a child that might be his and might not be, and it did not matter because she was right. He had no claim either way. And the tears came anyway, silent and steady and completely beyond his control. Evelina watched him cry. Her face did not soften. Her eyes did not warm. She watched with the careful, guarded attention of a woman who had seen this man perform 1,000 different versions of himself and was no longer willing to be moved by any of them until she was certain which one was real. A knock at the door broke the moment. Lucien entered without waiting for a response. His eyes went immediately to Adrian's face, registering the tears, then to Evelina's posture, reading the tension in her shoulders and the protective angle of her body. "There is a rider at the valley mouth," Lucien said. He looked at Adrian. "He says he is yours. Name of Rowan Greaves." Adrian wiped his face with the back of his hand. The gesture was rough, graceless, the motion of a man who did not know what to do with the water on his own cheeks. "I told him not to follow me. He did not listen." Lucien's voice carried a faint edge of something that might have been respect. "He says there is an emergency. A messenger arrived at the capital an hour after you left. Rowan rode hard to catch you." "What kind of emergency?" "The kind that cannot wait." Lucien stepped aside from the doorway, and the cold mountain air rushed in and cut through the warmth of the room like a knife through cloth. Adrian looked at Evelina. She was standing by the shelves with her arms crossed over her chest, over the swell of the child, and her face was unreadable. "Go," she said. "We are not finished. We are finished when I say we are finished." She held his gaze. "Go find out what is burning now." Adrian limped out of the healing house into the dark mountain square. The cold hit his damp face and turned the tear tracks to ice. Rowan was standing beside his horse at the far end of the square, and even from 30 feet away, Adrian could see that something was very wrong. Rowan's posture was different, rigid, the kind of rigid that comes from carrying information so bad that the body physically braces against the weight of it. Adrian crossed the square. Every step was a negotiation between his will and his knee. He reached Rowan and looked at his captain's face and saw something there he had never seen before. Fear. Not the controlled professional fear of a soldier facing battle. Raw, genuine, personal fear. The kind of fear that lives in the gut and tastes like copper and makes a man's hands cold. "Talk," Adrian said. Rowan's jaw worked for a moment before the words came. Lord Ashworth declared for the rebellion. His forces joined with Harlan and Mercer 2 days ago. They have a combined army of 6,000 men. They marched on the capital this morning. Adrian's stomach dropped. The sensation was physical, a plummeting, a hollowing, as if someone had removed the floor beneath his internal organs and let them fall into an abyss. 6,000, he repeated. "Against our 1,100. Rowan swallowed. "But that is not the worst of it. How can that not be the worst of it?" Rowan reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of parchment. He handed it to Adrian, and Adrian unfolded it and read it by the light of the lanterns that hung from the healing house eaves. And as he read, the last remaining structure inside him, the scaffolding of hope and purpose, and the fragile belief that things could still be salvaged, collapsed with a silence that was louder than any sound he had ever heard. The letter was from Celine. It was addressed to Lord Ashworth, and it was dated 3 weeks before the war even started. 3 weeks before the first battle, before the first soldier died, before the first village burned. And it laid out, in Celine's elegant, precise handwriting, every detail of Adrian's military strategy, every troop position, every supply route, every defensive weakness in the capital's fortifications. It laid out the treasury access codes. It laid out the bribery schedule for the border guards. It laid out a timeline for draining the emergency reserves and a plan for the subsequent evacuation. And at the bottom, in a line that Adrian read 4 times because his brain refused to process it, Celine had written, "Once the crown falls, Ashworth takes the throne and I return as his queen consort. The Vale dynasty ends with Adrian. Make certain of it." The paper shook in Adrian's hands. His fingers were trembling so violently that the words blurred and reformed and blurred again. He stared at the letter, and he felt something fundamental rearrange itself inside his chest, some deep tectonic shift in the bedrock of who he was and what he believed about the world and his place in it. She had not betrayed him after the war. She had started the war. The entire conflict, every battle, every siege, every burned village and shallow grave and orphaned child and shattered family, all of it, every drop of blood that had soaked into the soil of Aldenmere for 3 months of fighting had been orchestrated. Manufactured, engineered by the woman who had lain beside him every night and whispered that she loved him while she systematically dismantled his kingdom and sold it to his enemies. Adrian's knees buckled, not his damaged one this time, both of them. He went down hard onto the cold stone of the mountain square, the letter still clenched in his fist, and the sound that came out of him was not a scream and not a sob, but something between, something animal, something that had no language, because language had not been invented to describe what it felt like to discover that the person you chose over everything and everyone had never been a person at all, but a weapon aimed at your heart by people who smiled while they pulled the trigger. Rowan was beside him instantly, gripping his shoulder. Adrian. Adrian's breath was coming in short, ragged, tearing gasps. His vision was fragmenting. The square, the mountains, the healing house, the warm windows, all of it was splitting into pieces and rearranging into a landscape he did not recognize, a world where nothing he thought he knew was real and everything he thought was solid was smoke. She started it, he gasped. Rowan. She started all of it. The war, the rebellion, everything. It was all... I know. Rowan's voice was rough but steady. We intercepted the letter from a courier heading south. There are more. A whole network of correspondence between Celine and the rebel lords dating back over a year. She was playing both sides. She was playing everyone. Adrian pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the square. The chill seeped through his skin and into his skull, and he welcomed it because it was the only thing that felt real. How many people died? He said into the ground. His voice was muffled, broken. How many people died in that war, Rowan? Give me a number. Rowan was quiet for a long time. Conservative estimate, 12,000 soldiers. Twice that in civilians, villages, towns, farmland. The entire southern corridor is still burning. Adrian made that sound again, that terrible wordless sound. She killed 20,000 people. And I let her. I opened the door and I let her in and I gave her the keys to everything and He choked. I pushed away the one person who saw it coming because believing Celine was easier than believing the woman who actually loved me. He stayed on the ground. The cold stone pressed against his forehead, and his broken knees screamed, and his hands were flat on the rough surface, and he could feel the grit and the ice beneath his palms. And he thought about 12,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians, and the shallow graves by the roadside, and the children playing in rubble, and the old woman sorting through broken bricks because no one was coming to help. He thought about Evelina walking through that devastation on bleeding feet. He thought about the child growing inside her. He thought about Lucian Ward standing in the throne room and saying, "That is who you threw away." And something in Adrian Vale died on that stone square in the mountain dark. Something that had been clinging to life through stubbornness and denial, and the particular resilience of male ego finally let go, finally loosened its grip, finally surrendered to the gravity of accumulated consequence. It was not his pride, because pride had died in the throne room when he read the empty treasury reports. It was not his hope, because hope had died somewhere on the road north when he passed the shallow graves. It was something deeper than both, something structural. The fundamental belief, wired into him since childhood, hammered into him by a father who ruled through dominance and a court that rewarded strength above all else, that being a king meant being in control, that power was something you held, that authority was something you owned, that love was something that came to you because of what you were, instead of something you earned by who you chose to be. That belief died on the cold stone, and its death left a hollow space inside his chest that felt like the aftermath of an explosion, ringing and raw and terrifyingly empty. Adrian pushed himself up from the ground. His arms shook, his knee buckled, and he caught himself and tried again, and this time Rowan grabbed his arm and hauled him upright and held him steady while the world spun. He looked back at the healing house. Evelina was standing in the doorway again. Lucienne was beside her, one hand on her arm, and the protective geometry of their bodies together. His height sheltering her, her weight leaning slightly toward him. The unconscious choreography of two people who had learned to stand together told Adrian everything that words had not. She was not coming back. She was never coming back. Not because she was angry, not because she was bitter, not because she wanted revenge, because she had found what he had failed to give her, and she had found it in a man who did not need to be broken before he understood what it meant to stand beside someone instead of in front of them. Adrian looked at Rowan. How long before they reached the capital? 3 days. Maybe 4 if the weather holds them. 1,100 men against 6,000. Rowan nodded. Adrian straightened his spine. The movement hurt in ways that were not physical. It hurt the way shedding skin hurts, the way leaving something behind hurts. the way every necessary transformation in the history of the human species has hurt, because growth does not come from comfort. It comes from the place where the old structure fails and the new one has not yet been built, and you are standing in the gap with nothing but the raw, unfinished materials of who you might become. "Send word to the capital," Adrian said. "Tell our soldiers to hold the walls. Tell them their king is coming home." "Adrian." Rowan's face was gray. "We cannot win this. You know that. 1,100 against 6,000. The walls are damaged. The supplies are gone. I did not say we would win," Adrian said. "I said I am coming home." He turned and looked at Evelina one last time across the dark square. She was watching him, and in the lantern light he thought he saw something move across her face, something that was not forgiveness and not love, but might have been the faintest, most reluctant flicker of recognition. As if she could see, for the first time, the outline of the man he might have been if he had made different choices. And the sight of that ghost caused her something that she would never admit to and he would never be allowed to comfort. "I am sorry," he said, not loud enough for her to hear, just loud enough for the words to exist in the air between them, carried on cold breath in the mountain dark. "I am sorry for everything." Then he turned to Rowan. "Get me a fresh horse. We ride through the night. Your knee will hurt. Things that matter usually do. Get me the horse." Rowan moved. Adrian limped toward the edge of the square where the horses were tied, and behind him he heard Lucien's low voice say something to Evelina and Evelina's quiet response. And he forced himself not to turn around because turning around was what the old Adrian would have done. The old Adrian would have turned and made a scene and issued commands and tried to bend the moment to his will through the sheer force of his personality. The new Adrian, the one being born right now in the wreckage of the old one, wet and raw and blinking in the harsh light of consequence, kept walking. He reached the horses. Rowan brought a Highland mare, smaller than his gray but fresh and sure-footed. Adrian gripped the saddle with both hands and put his good foot in the stirrup and hauled himself up with an effort that tore something in his shoulder and sent a wave of nausea through him so intense that he had to close his eyes and breathe through clenched teeth for 10 full seconds before the world stabilized. He opened his eyes. Lucien was standing at the edge of the square, watching him. Those flat green eyes held no hostility now, no contempt, just the steady measuring gaze of a soldier watching another soldier ride toward a fight he probably would not survive. "Commander Ward," Adrian said. Lucien gave a single short nod. "Take care of her." Adrian's voice was steady and wrecked and honest in a way that cost him everything he had left. "Whatever happens in the capital, whatever happens to me, you take care of her and you take care of the child, and you do not let anyone from that palace ever touch them again." Lucien held his gaze for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice carried something it had not carried before, something that sounded almost like respect. "You did not need to ask me that. I know." Adrian gathered the reins, but I needed to say it. He turned the horse south, toward the pass, toward the ruined capital, toward 1,100 men and a 6,000-strong army and the near certain end of everything he had ever been. Rowan fell in beside him. The two horses moved together through the dark mouth of the pass, hooves echoing off granite, and the cold mountain air swallowed them inch by inch until the warm lights of the valley were nothing but a faint glow behind them, fading, gone. And Adrian Vale rode toward his kingdom with no army, no treasury, no allies, and no plan. But for the first time in his life, he rode without the weight of his own lies on his back, and the absence of that weight felt less like freedom and more like falling. The long, terrible, necessary fall that comes before a man either hits the ground and shatters or discovers, in the final desperate seconds, that he has wings he never knew about because he never had the courage to jump. Behind him, in the Highland Valley, Evelina Ashford stood in the doorway of her healing house and pressed both hands against the life growing inside her and watched the dark mouth of the pass where the man who had once been her whole world had just disappeared. She did not cry. She had promised herself that a long time ago, but her hands trembled on her belly, and Lucien saw it, and he said nothing, and he stood beside her in the silence, and the silence between them was the kind that holds more than words ever could. And 60 miles to the south, 6,000 soldiers carrying the banners of 3 rebel lords began their march on a capital that had barely survived the last war and would not survive another. And at their center, riding in a covered carriage with silk curtains and stolen gold and the calm, beautiful, monstrous patience of a woman who had been planning this for longer than anyone knew, Celine smiled. She had always known Adrian would go north. She had counted on it. And the trap she had set was not in the capital. It was on the road home. They hit the ambush 12 miles south of the pass. Adrian felt it before he saw it. A wrongness in the air, a shift in the way the wind moved through the narrow gorge, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. His horse felt it too. The mare's ears flattened and her stride shortened, and she began that sideways stepping that animals do when their instincts are screaming something their riders have not yet figured out. "Rowan," Adrian said. Rowan was already reaching for his sword. The sound came first, a low whistle from the ridge above them, the kind of signal that bounces off stone walls and arrives from everywhere at once, so that by the time your brain determines the direction, it is already too late. Arrows. They came from the eastern ridge, a volley of 20 or more, streaking down through the gray pre-dawn light like black rain falling at the wrong angle. Adrian threw himself flat against the mare's neck and felt the air part above his back as two shafts passed close enough to clip the fabric of his coat. One struck the ground in front of the horse, and the mare screamed and reared, and Adrian's damaged knee slammed against the saddle with a force that sent white fire through his entire left side. Rowan was bellowing, "Ambush! Dismount! Get to the rocks!" But there were no soldiers behind them. It was just the two of them on a narrow mountain road in the gray hour before dawn, and above them on the ridge, dark shapes were rising from behind stone outcroppings, and there were more of them than Adrian could count in the chaos of the moment, but his soldier's brain did the math anyway. 20, maybe 25. Professional positioning, staggered lines, covering fields of fire. This was not bandits. This was military. Adrian threw himself off the horse. The landing was catastrophic. His braced knee hit a rock, and something inside the joint made a sound like a green branch snapping, and the pain was so enormous, so total, that his lungs locked, and he could not draw breath for 3 full seconds. He rolled behind a boulder and pressed his back against the cold stone and forced air into his chest through sheer willpower and rage. Rowan crashed down beside him. His sword was drawn, and there was blood on his left arm where an arrow had sliced the outer edge of his bicep. A shallow cut that was bleeding freely, but was not deep enough to matter. "How many?" Adrian gasped. 20 plus on the eastern ridge. Could be more on the west. Rowan's eyes were scanning the terrain, calculating, processing. "This is a kill box. They knew we were coming through this pass." Celine. The name tasted like poison. Of course, Celine had known he would go north. She had sent Lucien with the letter. She had orchestrated the meeting. She had dangled Evelina in front of him like bait because she knew, she had always known, exactly which strings to pull to make him move where she wanted him to move. And now he was pinned behind a boulder in a mountain gorge with one good leg and no weapon, and 25 armed soldiers on the ridge above him. And the woman who had engineered it all was riding toward his capital in a silk-curtained carriage, and every single piece of this had been planned with the kind of meticulous, patient, sociopathic brilliance that Adrian had mistaken for love. Adrian's mind was doing something it had not done in months. It was going cold, not numb, cold. The way metal gets cold, the way a blade gets cold when it has been sitting in snow for a long time, and the temperature drops so far below functional that it comes out the other side into a kind of terrible crystalline clarity where everything is sharp and nothing bleeds. He had no weapon. He had a shattered knee. He had one ally, and above him were 24 soldiers who had been positioned there by a woman who knew his movements before he made them. A man with everything to lose calculates odds and retreats. A man with nothing to lose calculates odds and attacks. The difference is not courage. The difference is arithmetic. When the subtraction is complete and the number on the remaining side of the equation is 0, fear loses its purchasing power. It has nothing left to threaten. Adrian's number was 0. "Give me your belt knife," he said to Rowan. Rowan looked at him. "Are you—" "The knife, Rowan." Rowan reached to his hip and pulled the short blade from its sheath and pressed it into Adrian's hand. It was a working knife, not a fighting weapon, 6 inches of plain steel with a leather grip worn smooth by years of use. Against 25 armed soldiers, it was less than nothing. It was an insult. Adrian gripped it anyway. A second volley of arrows hit the boulder and the ground around them. Stone chips flew. One arrow buried itself in the dirt 2 inches from Adrian's outstretched leg. The shooters were adjusting, finding the angles, walking their fire toward the gaps in the cover. "They will flank us in 3 minutes," Rowan said. His voice was professional, detached, the voice of a man who had survived enough battles to know exactly how dying happened and was not inclined to be dramatic about it. 2 teams moving down the ridgeline on either side. The standard pincer. "We need to move." "Move where?" "Down the gorge. There is a narrow section 40 yards south where the walls close to 10 feet apart. Harder to shoot into, easier to defend. If we—" An arrow hit Rowan's horse. The animal screamed, a terrible high-pitched sound that echoed off the stone walls and multiplied into something that sounded like the mountain itself crying out. The horse went down hard, thrashing, and its legs kicked the air and then stopped. Adrian looked at Rowan. Rowan's face was grim but steady. They locked eyes, and something passed between them that did not need words. The silent agreement of 2 men who understood that the next 5 minutes would determine whether they lived or died, and that the answer was almost certainly the latter, and that they were going to fight anyway, because that is what men do when the math says 0 and the body says keep moving. "Now," Adrian said. They ran. Adrian could not run. His left leg was a ruin. What he did was closer to a controlled fall, a lunging, lurching, desperate forward motion that used momentum and adrenaline and the belt knife as a makeshift crutch jammed into the ground with each stride. Rowan grabbed his arm and hauled and half-carried him, and arrows struck the ground around them, behind them, in front of them, and the sound of metal heads hitting stone was like a dozen hammers striking anvils in rapid, arrhythmic succession. 40 yards, 30, 20. An arrow took Rowan in the back of his left thigh. He grunted, stumbled, kept moving. The shaft was sticking out of his leg at an angle that meant it had gone deep into the muscle, and blood was running down his calf and into his boot and leaving dark prints on the stone. But Rowan did not slow down because slowing down meant dying, and Rowan Greaves had not survived 9 years of Adrian's catastrophically bad decisions to die in a gorge at dawn. They reached the narrow section. The walls rose sheer on both sides, close enough that Adrian could touch both by extending his arms. The sky above was a thin strip of gray. The shooters on the ridge could still fire down, but the angle was wrong now, too steep, and the arrows that came struck the upper walls and shattered harmlessly. Adrian collapsed against the stone. His chest was heaving. His knee had gone beyond pain into a numb, dead zone that was probably worse than pain because it meant something structural had failed. Sweat and blood were mixing on his skin and running into his eyes, and the salt burned, and he wiped at it with the back of his hand, and the hand came away red. Rowan slid down the opposite wall. The arrow in his thigh was still there. He looked down at it, gripped the shaft, and snapped it off 2 inches from the entry point. The sound was small and decisive. He did not flinch. He pressed a wadded piece of his sleeve against the wound and leaned his head back against the stone and breathed. "You good?" Adrian said. "I have an arrow in my leg, and we are trapped in a canyon with 25 soldiers above us and no exit strategy. I am outstanding." Adrian almost laughed. The impulse was insane, inappropriate, the kind of delirious humor that surfaces when the human brain is overloaded with cortisol and has to release pressure through whatever valve is available. He did not laugh. But the corner of his mouth twitched, and Rowan saw it, and Rowan's mouth twitched back, and for one absurd, flickering second, they were just 2 men who had been through too much together to be afraid of one more terrible situation. The humor died when boots hit stone. They were coming down. Adrian could hear them, the scrape and slide of soldiers descending the ridge, using ropes or handholds to drop into the gorge behind and ahead of them. The pincer Rowan had predicted, closing from both directions. Adrian gripped the belt knife. 6 inches of steel. His hand was slippery with blood and sweat, and he adjusted his grip and adjusted it again, and his fingers found the position they wanted and locked there. "How many rounds do you have?" he said. Rowan patted the quiver on his belt. 4 bolts for the crossbow. He pulled the compact weapon from his back. It was a cavalry model, designed for mounted use, short range but powerful. He loaded it with the efficient speed of muscle memory. 4 shots. Then my sword. 4 shots and a sword and a belt knife. Against 25. Adrian pressed his back against the stone wall and he thought about Evelina. Not the Evelina of the healing house, not the Evelina with the hard eyes and the hard words and the child in her belly. He thought about the Evelina of the garden, the morning after their bonding, with the tea and the sunlight and the hope in her eyes that he had been too stupid and too blind to recognize as the most valuable thing anyone had ever offered him. "I am here, Adrian. I am here, and I will not leave." She had kept that promise until he made keeping it impossible. And here he was, kneeling in a stone canyon with a broken knee and a useless knife. And the cosmic irony was so perfect and so cruel that it felt engineered, as if the universe had been watching him waste every gift it gave him and had finally decided to present the bill. The first soldier appeared at the southern mouth of the narrow section. He was armored in leather and chain, carrying a short sword and a round shield, and he moved with the cautious efficiency of a man who had been told his target was a crippled king and an injured captain, and this would be easy. Rowan's crossbow bolt took him through the throat. The soldier dropped without a sound, his shield clanging against the stone floor, and the echo of that clang was still ringing when two more soldiers came around the corner, stepping over their fallen comrade. And behind them were two more. And behind them was the dark suggestion of even more bodies filling the gorge. Rowan fired again. Second bolt took the left soldier in the chest. The right one raised his shield and charged, and Rowan dropped the crossbow and drew his sword and met the charge with a lateral cut that caught the man's exposed arm below the shield and opened it from wrist to elbow. The soldier screamed and dropped his weapon, and Rowan kicked him backward into the soldiers behind him, and the narrow space filled with the sound of metal and boots and men cursing and the wet, meaty impact of bodies colliding. Behind them. Adrian heard it. Boots from the northern end. They were coming from both sides. He turned. Two soldiers were 10 feet away, moving carefully, swords drawn, shields up. They saw Adrian. One man, no armor, broken leg, holding a knife. And they spread apart to the width the narrow walls allowed, and advanced with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who knew the math was on their side. Adrian did not wait for them to reach him. He pushed off the wall and drove forward with his good leg, all his weight behind the belt knife, aimed not at the soldier's shield or sword arm, but at the gap between his helmet and his collar, the 2-inch strip of exposed neck that every soldier tried to protect, and every desperate man learned to target. The soldier saw him coming and raised his shield, but Adrian was already inside the shield's arc, too close, and the 6 inches of plain steel found the gap and sank in, and the soldier made a sound like air escaping a punctured wineskin and went down. Adrian ripped the knife free and took the dead man's sword from his hand, and now he had a weapon, a real weapon, and the weight of it in his grip was so familiar and so necessary that his body responded before his mind could catch up. His stance widened, his shoulders dropped, his breathing steadied. 9 years of combat training and 3 wars of practical application surged through his nervous system like electrical current, and for the first time since the ambush began, the survival mathematics shifted. The second soldier hesitated. That hesitation cost him a half second, and in close quarters combat a half second is the difference between the living and the dead. Adrian's borrowed sword came across in a flat arc that beat the man's blade aside, and the follow-through caught him across the upper arm, and the soldier stumbled backward and Adrian was on him, driving forward on one good leg and one ruined one, and the pain in his knee was a distant, irrelevant fact in a different universe, because this universe contained nothing but the blade and the body in front of him and the primal, white-hot imperative to keep moving, keep cutting, keep breathing. The second soldier fell. Adrian stood over him, swaying, gasping, holding the bloody sword in a grip that was half skill and half rigor mortis. His knee had given out completely. He was standing on one leg. The brace had snapped at some point during the charge, and the pieces hung from his thigh like broken armor. Behind him, Rowan was fighting 3 men at once. The narrow space worked for them. The soldiers could only come 1 or 2 at a time. But Rowan was injured. The arrow wound in his thigh was bleeding through the improvised bandage, and each parry was slower than the last. Adrian turned and threw the belt knife. It was not a throwing knife. It was not balanced for it. It tumbled end over end through the narrow space and hit the nearest soldier in the shoulder with the handle. Not the blade, but the impact was enough. The man flinched. Rowan's sword found the gap his flinch created, and the fight in the narrow section became 2 against 1, then 2 against none. And then Adrian and Rowan were standing back to back in the narrow gorge with dead men at their feet, and blood on their hands and their chests, heaving like bellows. "More coming," Rowan gasped. He was leaning heavily on his good leg. His face was gray beneath the dirt and blood. Both sides. Adrian could hear them. The scrape of boots on stone, the clink of armor, the low murmur of soldiers regrouping, adjusting tactics now that they had learned the hard way that a crippled king and an injured captain in a tight space were significantly more dangerous than anticipated. Adrian leaned against the wall. His body was failing. He could feel it happening in real time, the systematic shutdown of non-essential functions, as his system diverted everything it had to the heart and the lungs and the muscles still capable of swinging a sword. His peripheral vision was narrowing. His hearing was going sharp and selective, filtering out everything except threats. His mouth tasted like iron, and his hands were numb, and his heartbeat was a wild, irregular hammer in his chest that felt less like a rhythm and more like an argument between muscle and fatigue. "Rowan," he said, "how many did we get?" Rowan counted the bodies. 6. So 19 left, give or take. Give or take. Rowan spat blood. He had bitten the inside of his cheek at some point. "I want you to know that this is the worst rescue mission I have ever been on. You were not supposed to come. You were not supposed to need me." Rowan's voice was rough, strained, but underneath the exhaustion there was something else, something that sounded almost like affection. "You are the single most difficult man I have ever served, Adrian. You have the strategic instincts of a blind mule. Your personal life is a catastrophe. You ignored the best woman you will ever meet for the worst one. And right now we are standing in a canyon full of dead men because you fell for a trap that a moderately intelligent child could have seen coming. Your point, my point, is that I am still here." Rowan turned his head and looked Adrian in the eye. "Despite all of that, despite everything, I am still here, and I need you to ask yourself why." Adrian stared at his captain, his friend, the one man who had never left, never defected, never wavered, not through the war, not through the collapse, not through the devastating parade of Adrian's failures. "Because you are a stubborn fool," Adrian said. "Because you are worth saving," Rowan said. "You always were. You just made it very, very difficult for anyone to prove it." The words landed in a place Adrian did not know he still had. A soft place. A place that had not been armored or walled off or burned. He felt them settle there like a seed in cracked ground, and he did not have time to process what they meant because the boots were getting closer and the next wave was coming. A horn sounded, not from the ridge, not from the soldiers in the gorge, from somewhere else, somewhere north. The sound was low and long, and it bounced off the stone walls of the canyon and multiplied into a rolling, resonant blast that shook dust from the upper ridges and silenced every other sound in the gorge. Adrian knew that horn. He had heard it once before, in the throne room, in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who did not bow. "Highland militia," Rowan breathed. The sound of hooves followed the horn. Not a few. Many. The thunder of mounted riders coming through the northern pass at full gallop, and the sound grew and grew until the stone walls vibrated with it, and the ground beneath Adrian's feet trembled. Then the screaming started, not from Adrian's side of the gorge. From the ridges. From the soldiers who had been positioned there by Celine's plan. The soldiers who were now discovering that the kill box they had set up so carefully had just become their own trap, because Highland cavalry was pouring into the gorge from the north, and the soldiers on the ridge were caught between the sheer walls and the mounted fighters below, and the narrow terrain that had been designed to pin Adrian was now pinning them. Adrian leaned against the wall and listened to the battle above him, and he breathed. Rowan slid down the wall and sat on the ground with his legs extended and his bloody sword across his lap, and he breathed. The fighting lasted 12 minutes. Adrian counted. Not deliberately. His brain was in survival mode, and survival mode counts things. Heartbeats, breaths, seconds, the number of screams and the duration of each one, and it stores all of it in the short-term memory with the clinical efficiency of a machine that does not care about meaning, only data. When the last scream faded and the hooves slowed from gallop to trot to walk, a voice called down into the narrow section. "Adrian Vale, are you alive down there?" The voice was Lucian Ward's. Adrian closed his eyes. He tilted his head back against the cold stone wall, and he let his body do what it had been refusing to do for the last 15 minutes. It shook. Head to toe, violent, uncontrollable tremors that rattled his teeth and made the borrowed sword clatter against the ground beside him. Not cold, not fear, The chemical aftermath of sustained mortal terror metabolizing through muscle tissue that had been locked in fight mode and was now crashing through the other side into a state that had no name but felt like drowning on dry land. "We are alive," he called back. His voice was barely recognizable. "Rowan is hurt." "So are you," from the sound of it. Boots on the stone. Lucian appeared at the northern mouth of the narrow section, outlined against the gray morning light. He looked at the bodies on the ground. He looked at the blood on the walls. He looked at Adrian, slumped against the stone with a broken knee and a borrowed sword, and the shattered remains of his leg brace hanging from his thigh. "How many did you kill in here?" Lucienne said. "6," Rowan answered from the ground. His eyes were closed. "3 his, 3 mine. He is better than he looks." "He would have to be," Lucian said. Highland soldiers appeared behind him, moving into the gorge, checking the fallen, securing the area. They moved with the efficiency of men who trained in mountain terrain and fought in mountain terrain, and knew every rock and shadow in these canyons the way a carpenter knows the grain of wood. Lucien crouched in front of Adrian. His green eyes moved across the damage, clinical and quick. "The leg is finished. You are not riding anywhere on that. I have to get to the capital. You have to get off this ground before you bleed out." Lucian stood and signaled to 2 of his soldiers. "Get him up. Careful with the left leg." They lifted Adrian between them. The movement sent a cascade of agony through his knee that made his vision flash white and his stomach convulse. But there was nothing in his stomach to come up, so he dry-heaved into the cold air, and the sound of it echoed in the narrow gorge like a sick animal. They carried him out of the narrows and into the wider section of the gorge where the Highland riders were assembled. Adrian counted them through his blurred vision. 40, maybe 50. Mounted on Highland ponies built for mountain roads, armed with short bows and curved swords, and the hard, weathered faces of men and women who lived in a place that did not forgive weakness. They laid him on a flat rock beside the road. Rowan was carried out behind him and set down nearby. A Highland medic moved between them, cutting away fabric, cleaning wounds, packing injuries with moss and herb poultices that stung like fire and smelled like the forest floor. Adrian looked up at Lucien, who was standing over him with his arms crossed. "You followed us," Adrian said. "I followed you." Lucien's voice was flat. "Evelina asked me to." Adrian processed that. She knew. She suspected. After you left, she sat quiet for about 10 minutes. Then she said, "Celine knows he went north. She knows the route back, and she has had weeks to plan. So Evelina called the ambush before it happened. Evelina has been calling your mistakes before they happened for years." Lucian looked at him, and the expression on his face was complicated. Anger and grudging admiration, and something else that might have been the exhausted recognition of one protector acknowledging another. "You are just the last person to notice." Adrian lay on the flat rock with the medic working on his knee and the gray mountain sky above him, and the sound of Highland soldiers moving through the gorge, securing their dead and their injured. And he thought about Evelina sitting in the healing house after he left, quiet for 10 minutes, while her mind did what it had always done. Saw the danger before anyone else, calculated the angles, found the threat while everyone around her was still admiring the view. She had saved his life. Again. From 60 miles away. Without leaving her chair. The woman he had dismissed as paranoid and overly cautious had once again been the only person in the kingdom operating on accurate information, and she had deployed Lucien and his riders with a tactical precision that would have made any general in Adrian's war council look like an amateur. "How bad is the capital?" Adrian said. "Bad." Lucien sat on a rock across from him. "My scouts report the rebel army reached the outer walls at dawn. 1,100 defenders, 6,000 attackers. Your man in there. What is his name? The one you left in charge. Sergeant Callum Drake. He has pulled everyone inside the inner walls and sealed the gates. Smart. Buys time. But the inner walls were damaged in the last siege and time is all it buys. They will breach within 2 days." 2 days, Adrian repeated. "My riders can reach the capital in 1 if we push hard. But 50 Highland cavalry against 6,000 infantry is not a battle. It is a suicide note." Adrian looked at him. A cold clarity was settling over his mind again. Not the frantic clarity of the ambush, but something deeper, something strategic, the part of his brain that had won 3 wars before Celine dismantled everything from the inside. Not 50 against 6,000, Adrian said. 50 behind 6,000. They are besieging a walled city. Their attention is forward. Their supply lines are extended. Their rear is unprotected because they do not expect an attack from the north. Lucien studied him, his green eyes narrowed. You want to hit their supply train. I want to burn it. Adrian's voice was getting stronger. The medic had done something to his knee, packed it, braced it, and the new brace was tighter and more rigid than the old one, and the pain was settling into a constant, manageable roar instead of the random, crippling spikes that had been dropping him all day. Cut their food, cut their water, cut their communication with the border. 6,000 men without supplies do not stay 6,000 for long. Desertion starts in 48 hours. By the fourth day, you are fighting 3,000. By the sixth, half of those are too hungry to hold a sword. And Celine? Celine is in that army, in a carriage, with my treasury. Adrian sat up. The movement cost him, but he made it. She is the head. The lords are the body. Cut the supply lines and the body weakens. Take Celine and the head is gone. Take her how? She will be surrounded by guards. Adrian looked at Lucien Ward. Two men who loved the same woman in different ways, separated by everything and connected by the single point of Evelina Ashford, and between them the raw, unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them could do this alone. I need your riders, Adrian said, and I need you. Lucien was quiet for a long time. The mountain wind moved through the gorge and carried the smell of blood and pine and cold stone. I came here to protect Evelina, Lucien said, not to fight your war. This is not my war anymore. Adrian's voice was steady and wrecked and honest. This is her war. Celine sent that ambush to kill me on the road back from seeing her. Celine knew I went to the Highlands, which means Celine knows where Evelina is. And if I die here and the capital falls, there is nothing standing between Celine and the Northern Highlands. Nothing standing between Celine and Evelina. Nothing standing between Celine and the child. The words landed. Lucien's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his green eyes, fast and dark. The predatory calculation of a man reassessing the threat landscape and arriving at a conclusion he did not like. Adrian watched it happen. He watched the moment Lucien Ward stopped seeing him as the fool who had abandoned Evelina and started seeing him as the only man in the kingdom with the military experience to stop the woman who threatened her. The shift was visible, physical, a realignment of posture and priority that turned the Highland commander from a reluctant rescuer into an ally. If we do this, Lucien said, we do it my way, my riders, my tactics, my command on the ground. You plan. I execute. You do not give orders to my soldiers, and you do not override my calls in the field. Agreed. And when it is over, if we survive, you go back to your broken throne and you leave her alone, permanently. No visits, no letters, no claims on the child. She builds her life and you stay out of it. Adrian felt the words hit the soft place in his chest, the place where Rowan's words had landed earlier, the place that still hoped, in some small, pathetic, unkillable way, that this story had an ending where Evelina looked at him and saw something worth loving again. He killed that hope. Not easily, not painlessly, but deliberately, the way a surgeon amputates a limb that is poisoning the body. He reached inside himself and he found the last thread of the fantasy he had been carrying since he first said her name in the empty throne room. The fantasy where he knelt before her and she forgave him, and they rebuilt everything together, and he cut it. The severing was clean and it was permanent, and the emptiness it left was vast. Agreed, Adrian said. Lucien held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he stood and turned to his riders, and his voice carried across the gorge like a horn blast. Mount up. We ride south, full speed, no stops. The Highland riders moved, horses were brought. Rowan was lifted onto a mount and strapped to the saddle because he could no longer grip with his injured leg. Adrian was given a Highland pony built low and steady, designed for mountain terrain, and 2 soldiers helped him mount, and the pain in his knee when he swung his leg over was a scream he swallowed whole and buried in the iron vault of his will. 50 riders on a mountain road in the gray morning light, moving south toward a besieged capital, and at their center a broken king on a borrowed horse with no crown and no army, and nothing left to lose except the lives of the people he had failed and the future of the woman he had destroyed, and the tiny, fierce heartbeat growing in a highland valley 60 miles behind him. Adrian gripped the reins. His hands were bloody. His knee was a column of fire. His heart was doing something strange and irregular and too fast, and his breathing was shallow and his vision kept threatening to narrow, and his body was sending every signal it knew how to send that this was too much, that the damage was too extensive, that the machine was running on fumes and willpower and the borrowed time that the Highland medic's poultice had purchased. He ignored all of it. There is a point a man reaches where the body becomes irrelevant. Not through strength, through subtraction. When everything that can be taken has been taken, the crown, the treasury, the woman, the pride, the health, the hope, what remains is not a king. What remains is something more dangerous than a king because it has no throne to protect and no reputation to maintain and no future to worry about. What remains is the raw, stripped, essential machinery of a human being operating on nothing but the fuel of consequence, and that fuel burns hotter and longer and dirtier than anything ambition ever produced. Adrian Vale rode south on that fuel, and the kingdom of Aldenmere, broken and bleeding and burning, waited to see whether the man who had destroyed it had enough left in him to save it. 40 miles ahead, the capital walls groaned under the first ram strikes of the rebel siege, and inside those walls, 1,100 soldiers who had not eaten in 2 days tightened their grips on their weapons and listened to the sound of 6,000 men trying to break through the only thing standing between them and the end of everything. And somewhere in the center of that 6,000-strong army, in a silk-curtained carriage surrounded by 50 personal guards and the stolen wealth of a kingdom, Celine received word that the ambush in the mountain pass had failed. Her face did not change. She reached for a fresh piece of parchment. She dipped her pen, and she began writing a letter to Evelina Ashford. They hit the rebel supply train at dusk on the second day. Lucien had positioned his riders in a crescent formation along a wooded ridgeline 2 miles behind the rebel siege camp, and they waited in the failing light with the patience of people who had spent their lives hunting in terrain that punished impatience with death. The supply wagons came down the southern road in a long, slow column, 32 wagons carrying grain, water, arrows, medical supplies, and the daily rations for 6,000 soldiers who were burning enormous amounts of energy trying to break through the capital walls. The wagons had an escort of 40 infantry, 40 soldiers guarding the lifeline of an entire army. Adrian, lying on his stomach on the ridgeline with his ruined knee packed in fresh moss and his borrowed sword beside him, looked at that escort and understood something about the rebel lords that confirmed everything he had suspected. They were arrogant. They had committed everything to the siege because they believed Adrian was dead in a mountain gorge and Rowan was dead beside him, and there was no one left who possessed either the knowledge or the will to strike from behind. They had left their rear naked because they could not imagine a threat from a direction they had already conquered. Arrogance, the same disease that had destroyed Adrian, the same blindness, the same fatal assumption that strength meant invulnerability and that winning meant the fight was over. He recognized it the way a recovering addict recognizes the substance in someone else's hand, with a visceral, full-body understanding that bypassed intellect and went straight to the bone. "Now," Adrian said. Lucian's horn sounded, one long blast, one short. The Highland riders came down the ridge like water pouring over the edge of a cliff. They did not scream. They did not shout battle cries or bang their shields. They were silent. And the silence was worse than any war cry because it meant they were not performing. They were working. 50 riders in a silent crescent cutting through the escort like a scythe through standing wheat. And by the time the wagon drivers understood what was happening, it was already over. The escort broke in 90 seconds. Half of them died. The rest dropped their weapons and ran south toward the siege camp, and Lucien let them go because running men carry fear faster than any messenger, and fear was the weapon Adrian needed more than steel. "Burn them," Adrian said. The Highland riders put torches to the wagons. 32 supply wagons loaded with everything a besieging army needed to survive, and the fire took them one by one, and the smoke rose into the evening sky in a thick black column that was visible from the capital walls and from the rebel camp and from every point in between. And every person who saw that smoke understood exactly what it meant. The siege clock had just started running backward. Adrian watched the wagons burn from the ridgeline. The heat reached him even at that distance, dry and fierce, and the firelight turned the underside of the smoke cloud amber and orange, and the colors shifted and pulsed like something alive. He thought about the villages he had passed on the ride north, the burned houses, the shallow graves, the old woman sorting through broken bricks. Fire had been the signature of this war, the tool that both sides used to erase what the other had built. And now he was adding his own fire to the landscape, and the symmetry was not lost on him. But there was a difference. He could feel it in his chest, in the cold, clear space that had opened up where his old self used to be. The villages had burned because of negligence, because of arrogance, because a king had been too busy listening to a beautiful liar to protect the people who depended on him. These wagons were burning because of choice, deliberate, strategic, necessary choice. The difference between a house fire and a controlled burn: one destroys randomly. The other clears the ground so something new can grow. Adrian did not know if anything new would grow from the ashes of Aldenmere. He did not know if he would survive long enough to find out. But he knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in the body rather than the mind, that the man who had sat on the broken throne 3 weeks ago and said, "Where is she?" could not have made this choice. That man had been reaching backward, grasping for things he had lost, trying to reassemble a life from salvaged pieces. This man, the one lying on a ridgeline with a destroyed knee and borrowed weapons and an army of 50 that was not even his, this man was reaching forward, into the dark, into the unknown, into a future that contained no guarantees and no comfort and no Evelina. That was the hardest part. That was the part that the old Adrian could never have survived. The absolute, non-negotiable acceptance that the future he was fighting for did not include the thing he wanted most, that he was bleeding and breaking and burning supply trains for a kingdom that Evelina would never return to, for a throne he planned to dismantle, for people who might never forgive him. He was doing it anyway, not because it would earn him redemption, not because it would win her back, because it was the right thing to do, and doing the right thing without the expectation of reward was a skill he was learning at the age of 31, which was late, which was embarrassing, which was better than never. Lucian rode up beside him. The commander's face was lit by the burning wagons, and in that light the scar on his jaw looked like a crack in a mask revealing something molten underneath. "Done," Lucian said. "We need to move before they send riders to investigate." "The letter," Adrian said. "Celine's letter to Evelina. Did your scouts intercept it?" Lucian reached into his saddlebag and produced a sealed piece of parchment, caught the courier 5 miles out from the Highland Pass. He held it out. Adrian took it. He did not open it. He turned it over in his hands and looked at the seal, Celine's personal mark pressed into red wax, and he thought about every letter Evelina had written him that Celine had intercepted and buried and destroyed. Every warning, every plea, every attempt to reach through the wall that Celine had built between them. He broke the seal and read the letter by the light of the burning wagons. It was short. Celine had always been efficient with words. "Dear Evelina, I understand you are living in the Northern Highlands. I understand you are carrying a child. I understand the Highland commander has become your protector. I want you to know that none of these things will save you. Adrian is dead. His kingdom is mine. And you, sweet girl, are the last loose thread. Loose threads get cut. Expect me." Adrian folded the letter. He placed it in his coat, in the pocket with the other 2, and now he was carrying 3 letters close to his chest, and each one represented a different stage of the same catastrophe. Evelina's undelivered warning, Evelina's cold invitation, and Celine's promise of violence. "She wants Evelina dead," Adrian said. Lucien's face did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still and very dangerous, the way deep water goes still before a current shifts. "She will not touch her?" "No." Adrian's voice was iron. "She will not." They moved. 50 riders melting into the darkness, heading east along the tree line to circle around the rebel camp and approach the capital from the unguarded flank. Adrian rode in the center of the column with Rowan strapped to the horse beside him, semi-conscious. The arrow wound in his thigh, hot and swollen beneath the Highland dressing. The medic had said infection was setting in. Rowan needed a proper surgeon. Rowan needed rest and clean bandages and a warm bed and all the things that did not exist in a war zone. "Rowan!" Adrian kept his voice low. "Stay with me." Rowan's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused, but he smiled, and the smile was pure Rowan, stubborn, defiant, laced with the particular brand of dark humor that soldiers develop as a defense against the things they have seen. "Still here," Rowan murmured. Still stupidly, irrationally, here. They reached the eastern approach to the capital at midnight. The rebel camp was spread across the western plain in front of the main gates, thousands of campfires dotting the darkness like a fallen constellation. From the east, the capital's secondary wall was unguarded. The rebels had committed everything to the frontal assault because the secondary wall faced a steep ravine that was considered impassable for a large force. It was not impassable for 50 mountain riders on ponies bred for exactly this terrain. Lucian guided them down into the ravine and up the other side in single file, the horses picking their way along paths that were barely wider than their hooves. And Adrian gripped the saddle with both hands and felt the void beneath him, the 60-foot drop into darkness, and his body produced fear, and he acknowledged it and kept moving because the time for being governed by fear was over. They reached the secondary gate at midnight. Adrian hammered on the iron-reinforced wood with the pommel of his borrowed sword. "Open up, it is Adrian Vale." Silence from within. Then a voice, young, scared, disbelieving. "The king is dead. Lord Harlan announced it 2 days ago. Lord Harlan is a traitor and a liar. And I am standing outside your wall with a destroyed knee and 50 Highland soldiers and approximately 0 patience. Open this gate or I will find a way to climb it, and the first person I see on the other side will regret making me use my leg." A long pause. Then the sound of bolts being drawn, iron scraping against iron, and the secondary gate swung inward, and the face that appeared in the gap was young, barely 20, with wide eyes and a soldier's helmet that was too big for his head. Adrian looked at him. "What is your name, son?" "Private Tomlin, sir." The young soldier stared at him with the expression of a man seeing a ghost. "We thought, everyone said, everyone was wrong." Adrian limped through the gate. "Where is Sergeant Drake?" "Inner keep. He has not slept in 3 days. Take me to him." Callum Drake was a man built from gristle and bad decisions, and 22 years of military service that had left him with a face like a topographic map of every war Aldenmere had ever fought. He was sitting on an ammunition crate in the inner keep, staring at a map of the capital's defenses with the hollow, fixed gaze of a man who had run out of options 2 days ago and was now simply waiting for the mathematics of siege warfare to finish its work. He looked up when Adrian limped through the door, and for the first time in anyone's memory, Callum Drake's face showed genuine emotion. It moved through surprise into disbelief into something raw and ungoverned that he strangled back to composure within 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds were enough to tell Adrian everything about how bad things were inside these walls. "Your Majesty," Drake said. He stood. His legs were unsteady. "They told us you were dead." "Not yet." Adrian lowered himself onto a crate across from Drake and stretched his ruined leg in front of him and winced at the grinding protest of the joint. "Tell me everything. Fast." Drake talked. The numbers were brutal. 800 soldiers remaining from the original 1,100. 300 lost to desertion, injury, or the initial assault that breached the outer wall. Food for 2 days, maybe 3, with strict rationing. Water from the inner well, still flowing but contaminated with dust from the bombardment. The outer wall was gone. The inner wall had 3 breach points that were being held by rotating squads working 4 hours on, 2 hours off, and the men were exhausted beyond anything Drake had seen in 2 decades of war. "And the rebels," Adrian said. 6,000 strong, siege engines, ram at the main gate. They've been hitting us in waves. 3 hours of assault, 1 hour of rest, 3 more hours. Grinding us down. Drake's voice was flat, professional, but underneath it Adrian could hear the strain, the sound of a man describing a situation he believed was terminal. At current attrition rates, they breached the inner wall in 36 hours. Maybe less. Adrian placed Celine's intercepted letter on the crate between them. "Read that." Drake read it. His face did not change, but his hand tightened on the paper until the edges crumpled. "She started the war," Drake said. It was not a question. She started everything. And she is out there right now, in a carriage behind the rebel lines, with what remains of our treasury directing the siege. Adrian leaned forward. "I burned their supply train tonight. 32 wagons, everything. They will start feeling the hunger by tomorrow night. Desertion begins the day after. That still leaves us outnumbered 5-1 for the next 48 hours. "I know." Adrian looked at the map on the table. I need you to do something that goes against everything you have been trained to do. Drake waited. I need you to pull back from the breach points. Drake stared at him. Pull back. From the only things keeping them out. Controlled retreat. Leave the breach points lightly defended. Draw them through the inner wall and into the streets. Adrian traced a path on the map with his finger. Turned the city into the same kind of kill box they tried to use on me in the mountain gorge. Narrow streets, choke points, rooftop positions. Their numbers mean nothing in urban combat. 6,000 men in an open field is an army. 6,000 men in narrow streets is a traffic jam. Drake looked at the map. Then he looked at Adrian. Then he looked back at the map. If this fails, they take the entire inner city. If we do nothing, they take the entire inner city in 36 hours anyway. Adrian's voice was quiet and steady and carried the particular authority of a man who has accepted the worst-case scenario and is now working exclusively with the space that remains. We do not have a winning hand, Callum. We have a choosing hand. We choose where the fight happens. We choose the terrain. We choose to turn their strength into a liability. And while they are choking in the streets, Lucien's riders hit their camp from behind, burn what is left, and find Celine. At the sound of that name, Adrian's jaw set. Find Celine and bring her to me. Drake exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the sound of a career soldier recognizing a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and understanding that the distinction between the two often only becomes clear afterward. When? Drake said. Dawn. The next 6 hours were the most focused of Adrian's life. He worked with Drake and Lucien around the map table, positioning soldiers, identifying choke points, setting up rooftop archer positions, designating fallback lines and rally points, and the dozen small tactical decisions that would determine whether 800 exhausted soldiers could hold 6,000 in an urban maze long enough for hunger and confusion and Highland cavalry to turn the tide. Rowan was in the field hospital. The surgeon there, a grizzled man named Pell, who had been stitching soldiers back together since before Adrian was born, cleaned the arrow wound and packed it with a poultice that made Rowan curse so creatively that the other patients in the hospital stopped moaning and started listening. Adrian visited him before dawn. Rowan was lying on a cot with his leg elevated and his face gray but alert. He looked up when Adrian appeared and his eyes did the quick, automatic assessment that soldiers do with their own, scanning for new damage, new blood, new signs that the person in front of them was closer to breaking than the last time they checked. You look like you have not slept, Rowan said. I have not. You should. In approximately 90 minutes, I am going to order a controlled retreat that will let 6,000 soldiers into the inner city. Sleep is not on the agenda. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Then he shifted on the cot and swung his legs over the side. What are you doing? Adrian said, getting up. You cannot walk. Watch me. Rowan stood. His face went white, and he swayed, and he grabbed the edge of the cot, and he stood there, swaying, gray-faced, one leg bearing weight, and the other hovering an inch above the floor. And the stubbornness in his expression was so total, so absolute, so fundamentally Rowan, that Adrian felt something crack in his chest. Rowan, you are not doing this without me. Rowan's voice was thin, but his eyes were not. I did not follow you into a mountain ambush and take an arrow for the privilege of lying in a hospital bed while you fight the last battle of this war. Give me a crutch. Give me a wall to lean against and point me at the fight. Adrian looked at his captain, his friend, the man who had never left. You are the most stubborn human being I have ever known, Adrian said. That is because I learned from the worst, Rowan said. Dawn came gray and cold and heavy with the smell of smoke from the burned supply wagons. The rebel army stirred, assembled, began their morning assault on the breach points. Their commanders were irritated, aggressive, pushing harder than the previous days because the smoke from the supply train had made them nervous, and nervous generals compensate with violence. They hit the first breach point and found it lightly defended. 4 soldiers, falling back immediately. The rebels poured through, hundreds of them, flooding into the gap with the momentum of 6,000 men behind them, and the streets swallowed them. The capital of Aldenmere was an old city, built in layers over 3 centuries, with streets that had been laid down by people who did not think in straight lines. Narrow alleys twisted between stone buildings. Dead ends appeared without warning. Intersections multiplied and divided in patterns that were intuitive to the people who lived there and bewildering to anyone who did not. Adrian's soldiers were on the rooftops. They were in the alleys. They were behind barricades made from overturned carts and stacked furniture and anything else they could find. They waited until the rebel soldiers filled the streets like water filling a pipe, packed tight, unable to spread out, unable to use their numbers, and then they hit them from above and from the sides and from behind, and the screaming started. It was not a battle. It was a mechanism. Adrian had turned the inner city into a machine, a grinding, churning, claustrophobic machine that processed 6,000 soldiers into confused, separated, disoriented clusters of men who could not find their commanders and could not see the sky and could not understand why the city they were supposed to be conquering was eating them alive. Adrian commanded from a rooftop near the central square. His knee would not let him fight. He stood. He refused to sit, with Drake's map in one hand and a runner at his elbow, and he directed the defense the way a conductor directs an orchestra, reading the flow of the battle through the sound of it, the direction of the screaming, the density of the steel on steel, the rhythm of boots on stone. And he sent his soldiers where they were needed with the intuitive, almost unconscious precision of a man who had found the one thing he was genuinely good at, and was doing it without the interference of ego for the first time in his life. Lucien's horn sounded from outside the walls. One long blast, one short. The Highland Riders hit the rebel camp from behind. The camp was nearly empty. 6,000 soldiers had poured into the city, leaving their tents and their supplies and their command structure behind, and Lucien's 50 riders tore through it like a storm through paper. Tents collapsed. Remaining supply carts burned. The command tent where the rebel lords had coordinated their siege went up in flames, and the three lords who had started this rebellion, Harlan, Mercer, Ashworth, found themselves standing in the ruins of their camp with no supplies, no communication, and the sudden dawning realization that their army was trapped inside a city that had been turned into a killing floor. Lord Harlan surrendered first, then Mercer. Ashworth tried to run, and Lucien's riders caught him before he reached the tree line. And Celine. Lucien found her carriage a quarter-mile behind the camp on the road south, already moving. She had seen the Highland Riders coming, and she had done what she always did. She had calculated the odds, and she had moved to preserve herself and the assets she had stolen and the future she had been building on a foundation of corpses. Lucien's riders surrounded the carriage. The 4 personal guards assessed the situation, dropped their weapons, and stepped away. The driver climbed down and put his hands up. Lucien opened the carriage door. Celine was sitting inside on silk cushions, dressed in traveling clothes of deep burgundy, her dark hair pinned up, her face composed, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at Lucien with an expression of mild inconvenience, as if he had interrupted her during a meal rather than ended a campaign of treason and mass murder. She was beautiful, even now, even in this moment. The kind of beautiful that is a weapon because it makes people hesitate, makes them reconsider, makes them wonder if something this lovely could really be capable of the things it is accused of. Lucien did not hesitate. Celine Devereaux. You are under arrest for treason, conspiracy, theft of the royal treasury, and the murder of 12,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians. Get out of the carriage. Celine looked at him. Her dark eyes were calm, intelligent, measuring. She tilted her head. You must be the commander. Her voice was smooth, warm, with a slight musical quality that made every word sound like an invitation. Evelina's new protector. I have heard about you. Get out of the carriage. She smiled. It was the smile that had undone Adrian, the smile that had convinced a kingdom that she was its greatest asset, while she systematically dismantled it from the inside. The smile that had made 100 men feel like they were the only person in the room. It bounced off Lucien like a stone off granite. He reached into the carriage, took her arm, and pulled her out. Not roughly, not gently, with the complete professional indifference of a man removing an obstacle from a path. The rebel army surrendered by noon, without supplies, without their lords, without communication, trapped in narrow streets with enemies above and around them and no way to regroup. 6,000 soldiers laid down their weapons in groups of 10 and 20 and 50, emerging from the urban maze with their hands up and their faces carrying the stunned, disoriented expression of men waking up from a nightmare they had not realized they were in. Adrian watched from the rooftop. He watched until the last group surrendered. He watched until Drake's soldiers began the slow, methodical work of disarming and processing the defeated army. He watched until the streets were clear and the fires were out, and the capital of Aldenmere, battered and scarred and barely standing, was his again. Then his knee gave out for the last time. He went down on the rooftop like a tower collapsing, straight down, no stagger, no catch. His body had kept its promises as long as it could, and now it was done. The borrowed sword clattered away across the stone. His vision went dark. Sound receded to a distant underwater hum. And Adrian Vale, king of Aldenmere, lay on a rooftop in his ruined capital and felt the sky above him, gray and infinite and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened below it. He woke up 3 days later in the palace infirmary. Theravos was standing beside his bed, with her arms crossed, and her expression communicating a level of professional disapproval that could have cured diseases through sheer force of disappointment. "I told you 12 days, she said. Adrian blinked. His body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled by someone working from memory. Everything hurt, but the pain had a different quality now, duller, more distant. The pain of healing rather than the pain of breaking. "What happened?" he croaked. "You collapsed from blood loss, exhaustion, infection in the knee wound, and what I can only describe as a comprehensive failure of self-preservation instinct." Thera adjusted the bandage on his leg. "The knee is rebuilt. I operated while you were unconscious. You will walk again, but you will limp for the rest of your life. Consider it a souvenir." The rebellion. Over. "Your captain, Rowan, has been running the city from a chair because he also refuses to stay in bed. The rebel lords are in custody. The Highland commander has secured the outer walls. And Celine. She is in the tower cell, under guard. She has not spoken since she was brought in." Thera paused. She has, however, smiled. Twice. "I find it unsettling." Adrian lay in that bed for 2 more days before he could stand. When he finally got up, using a cane that Thera had fashioned from an oak branch, he walked slowly through the palace, through the corridors he had limped through weeks ago when the world was falling apart. And he saw something different. People were working. The rubble was being cleared. The shattered windows were being boarded. The cracked throne, he saw it when he entered the hall, had been removed from its platform and set aside, and in its place was a long table with 12 chairs, and Rowan was sitting in one of those chairs with his bandaged leg propped on another, arguing with Drake about grain distribution. Rowan looked up, took his time. "Good. You're awake. Sit down. We have work to do." Adrian sat. He looked at the table and the chairs and the absence of the throne, and he understood that Rowan had started without him, had begun the work of transformation while Adrian was unconscious, and the understanding did not sting the way it once would have. It felt right. It felt like the first true thing that had happened in this room in a very long time. Over the following weeks, Adrian did what he had told Lucien he would do. He dismantled the monarchy. Not all at once, not with a single dramatic gesture, but methodically, carefully, the way Evelina would have done it, one policy at a time, one authority transfer at a time, building a council structure that distributed power among the regions and removed the possibility of any single person ever again holding enough control to destroy everything. He wrote the Reformation Charter himself. 12 pages, in his own hand, detailing the structure of the new council, the limitations on executive authority, the rights of the regional territories, the protections for the people who had suffered most during the war. He worked on it for 6 days, and when it was finished, he read it once, corrected 2 errors, and signed it with a hand that did not shake. The day he presented it to the assembled lords and officers and citizens who had gathered in the throne hall, he stood at the head of the long table, not a throne, a table, and he spoke without notes. "I'm not going to tell you that I have changed. That is not something a man says. It is something a man proves over time through choices that cost him something. What I will tell you is this. I built this kingdom on the assumption that strength meant control and that authority meant knowing better than everyone around me. Those assumptions destroyed everything I touched. They killed 12,000 soldiers. They orphaned children and burned villages and drove the best person I have ever known out of this palace and into the wilderness." He paused. His voice was steady. His eyes were not. "I am disbanding the monarchy. From this day forward, Aldenmere is governed by a council of 12, elected by the people, accountable to the people. No single person will ever again hold enough power to do what I did. And I will spend whatever time I have left in this life trying to earn back even a fraction of the trust that I destroyed." He signed the charter in front of everyone. Then he placed the pen on the table and he walked out of the hall on his cane, limping, and he did not look back. 2 months later, on a morning in early spring when the first green was returning to the fields around the capital, Adrian rode north one last time. He rode alone. The road was different now. The villages he had passed in winter were being rebuilt, new timber framing rising from old foundations, market squares being cleared, fields being plowed. People were working, not because a king had ordered them to, because they had decided to. He reached the highland valley in the late afternoon. The light was golden, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory even while it is happening. The healing house was still there. The village was larger now, more houses, more smoke from more chimneys, the sound of children and animals, and the steady rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's forge. Lucien was waiting for him at the valley entrance. The commander looked the same, hard, weathered, those flat green eyes that gave nothing away and saw everything. They dismounted and stood facing each other. "I am not here to take anything," Adrian said. "I am here to give something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed document. He held it out. Lucien took it, read it. His expression shifted barely, a fracture in the granite composure. "This grants the Northern Highlands full autonomy," Lucien said, "permanent and irrevocable, ratified by the Council. The Highlands are yours. No taxes, no military obligation, no interference from the capital, ever." Lucien looked at him for a long time. Then he folded the document and placed it inside his coat, and the gesture was so similar to the way Adrian had been carrying Evelina's letters that both men noticed, and neither mentioned it. "She is in the garden," Lucien said, "behind the healing house." Adrian walked around the stone building and through a wooden gate and into a small garden where the spring had arrived early, and the first flowers were pushing through the cold soil in defiant clusters of color. Evelina was sitting on a bench with a blanket across her lap and a cup of tea in her hands. Beside her, in a woven basket lined with wool, a baby was sleeping, small, new, a face so fresh and so unmarked by the world that looking at it felt like looking at a clean page in a book that had not yet been written. Adrian stopped at the gate. Evelina looked up at him. The hardness was still there in her face, in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her gaze. But there was something else now, too, something that had not been there the last time he saw her. A settledness, a peace. Not the peace of someone who has forgotten what happened, but the peace of someone who has integrated it, who has taken the wreckage and the pain and the scars and has built them into the foundation of a new life that is stronger because it knows what collapse feels like. Adrian looked at the baby, his throat closed. "A boy," Evelina said. Adrian nodded. He could not speak. "His name is Callum, after the sergeant who held the capital walls." Evelina's voice was quiet but firm. "He was born 3 weeks ago. Lucien delivered him because the midwife was snowed in at the next village and could not get through the pass." Adrian stood at the gate and he looked at the child and he looked at the woman and he understood with perfect crystalline clarity that this was not his. None of it. Not the baby, not the garden, not the woman, not the peace. This was something that had been built in his absence, built because of his absence, and his only role in it was the role of the storm that had made the rebuilding necessary. He was the disaster they had survived, and the life they had built afterward was beautiful and complete, and it did not need him. "I came to say something," Adrian said. His voice was rough and quiet and carried the weight of everything he had been through since the last time he stood in this valley. Not to ask for anything, just to say it, out loud, to your face, because you deserve to hear it, and I deserve the cost of saying it. Evelina waited. "You were right. About everything. About Celine, about the treasury, about the war, about me. You were right, and I did not listen, and people died because of my arrogance." Adrian's hand tightened on his cane. "And the worst thing I did was not ignoring your warnings. The worst thing I did was making you believe that your voice did not matter, that your judgment was less than mine, that your loyalty was something I could spend without replacing." He paused. "I will carry that for the rest of my life. Not as punishment, as education. Because the most important thing I have ever learned cost me the most important person I have ever known. and that is a price I earned and a lesson I will not waste. The garden was quiet. A bird called from somewhere in the trees above them. The baby stirred in the basket and made a small sound, and Evelina's hand went to the blanket automatically, adjusting, soothing, the unconscious reflex of a mother whose body is tuned to every frequency her child produces. Adrian. Evelina looked at him, and for the first time, something in her dark eyes softened. Not into love, not into forgiveness, into something more nuanced and more human than either, into recognition. The recognition of one person seeing another person clearly, perhaps for the first time, and acknowledging that what they see is flawed and damaged and different from what it used to be, and also, somehow, more real. "I do not hate you," she said. "I thought I would. For a long time I tried to. But hatred requires an attachment I no longer have." She paused. "What I feel is something closer to sadness. Sadness for the life we could have had if you had been the man you are now, when you were the man you were then." The words hit Adrian in the center of his chest and stayed there, and he knew they would stay there for the rest of his life. And he knew that was right. Some things are not meant to be healed. Some things are meant to be carried. Not as burdens, but as ballast, the weight that keeps a ship steady in rough water, the gravity that prevents a man from floating away from the consequences that make him human. He looked at the baby one more time, small and sleeping and impossibly new. A life that had started in the middle of the worst chapter of the story and would grow up in the chapters that came after, chapters that Adrian would read about from a distance but never participate in. "Take care of him," Adrian said. Evelina looked at the child in the basket. The expression on her face was the most unguarded thing Adrian had ever seen her show him, a tenderness so raw and so fierce that it transformed her entire face and made him understand, with a final, aching certainty, that this was who she had always been. Not the political strategist, not the Luna, not the woman who warned kings about their blind spots. A person with an infinite capacity for love who had simply been waiting for someone worthy of receiving it. And that someone was a sleeping infant in a woven basket, not a broken king at a garden gate. "I will," she said. Adrian nodded. He turned. He walked back through the gate and around the healing house and through the village where people who did not know him and did not need to know him were going about the ordinary, extraordinary business of living their lives. Lucien was standing by the horses. He said nothing. He held Adrian's mount steady while Adrian pulled himself into the saddle with his one good leg and his cane and his permanent limp, and the two men looked at each other one last time. "You are a good man, Commander Ward," Adrian said. Lucien considered this. Then he said, "I am a man who made better choices than you did. That is not the same thing as good, but it is enough." Adrian rode south out of the valley. He did not look back. The road stretched ahead of him, long and scarred and uncertain, winding through a kingdom that was rebuilding itself one broken brick at a time. And he rode alone because that was what he had earned and what he deserved, and what he was learning, slowly and painfully, and with the particular stubbornness of a man who has finally run out of shortcuts, to accept. Behind him, in a garden in the northern highlands, Evelina Ashford lifted her son from his basket and held him against her chest, and felt his heartbeat against hers, tiny and steady and full of a future that belonged entirely to them. Lucien sat beside her on the bench. He did not put his arm around her. He did not need to. He was there, the way he had been there every day since she walked into his life on bleeding feet with nothing but a medical kit and the wreckage of a broken heart. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The light was fading. The mountains turned gold, then amber, then the deep, quiet purple of a day ending the way all days end, with the sun going down and the world continuing, and the people in it choosing, moment by moment, who they want to be when morning comes. Adrian Vale saved his kingdom. He lost the only woman he ever truly loved. And he learned in the hardest possible way that loyalty is not a thing you demand. It is a thing you build, one honest choice at a time, and once it is destroyed, no crown on earth can buy it back.